So what we want to do is cultivate a capacity for kindness. So, close your eyes. Take a few moments to breathe in and breathe out. So what we want to do is cultivate a capacity for kindness. So, close your eyes. Chat. How's everybody doing today? Let me just... Oh, whoops. Doesn't really do much. Okay. Looks very red, no? Maybe. Looks fine. Okay. How y'all doing? So welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alo Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I am a psychiatrist and we're going to be talking to another psychiatrist today, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice, and everything is for educational purposes only. If y'all have a question or concern for medical professionals, please go see a licensed professional and find out, you know, what y'all should do with that. How's everyone doing today? We doing good? I think today's going to be a cool stream. So we're going to be talking with Dr. Hsu about, or Dr. Hsu, we'll see. And Dr. Hsu is also focused on addictions, and so is an expert on marijuana. And so we'll be finding out a lot about marijuana. So I think we have a lot of questions in the community. We've had questions for a long time about like, what's the deal with marijuana? Can I safely smoke? Is it okay to smoke? What if I use weed just to go to sleep? And so, yeah, we're gonna talk to Dr. Hsu about it because he is the expert. Yeah. So I see that people are quoting Mr. Mackey, drugs are bad, okay? Yeah. So we'll find out about that, right? So I think this is where like people can say like, oh, drugs are bad, or people can say no, drugs are okay. And this is where like I think it's important to talk to experts who really know what they're talking about and understand the science behind stuff, and understand, even if we say that drugs are bad, period, what are the reasons behind that, right? Why do medical professionals, ourselves included, advise against the use of marijuana, generally speaking, or other substances? Like, what's going on there? So, yeah. Cool. So let's see, couple of quick announcements. So we've got, before we hop in with Dr. Hsu, we've got our May You Sleep Well event going on Discord. So this is an event to help our community fix their sleep schedule. So we're starting week 2 tomorrow. Lectures are every Tuesday at 9 a.m. Central. We have a Clean Your Room initiative going on. So if y'all are interested in like actually organizing your lives, fixing your sleep schedule, and cleaning your room, join us for that as well. So we're going to have dedicated hours to clean your room once again starting tomorrow. And then we also have a Study Together initiative in the month of May. So if you we'll have bot hosted lobbies that y'all can hang out in, do your pomodoros, get your pomos done, and hopefully sort of like structure your time for finals and things like that for those of y'all that have those. And yeah, sound good? What if you're cleaning your room right now? That's perfect. So that's part of what we do, right? We want to go ahead and have, y'all cleaning your room and hopefully learning something educational at the same time. So that's totally fine. Okay, let's go ahead and hop in with Dr. Hsu. Okay, 1 second. Let's test. Hey. Hey, Michael, how are you? Give me 1 second. Yes, hold on. Can you count to 10 for me?
Sure. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, perfect.
4. Is this live or is this still part of?
Yeah, no, we're live.
Okay, here we go.
We're good to go. Okay.
Great.
So I'm going to go ahead and switch over. So people, why don't we just start? Welcome, Michael, or Dr. Hsu. How do we pronounce your last name?
Yeah, Dr. Hsu. You said it just right the first time.
Okay.
So yeah, I just want to say a couple of quick things up front, maybe.
Sure.
I think first of all, just a quick disclaimer for viewers. One thing is that I recently joined the Scientific Advisory Board of Healthy Gamer. Did want to put that out there. And I know that's something that might be announced later on this week as well.
Sure.
I am, a physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and part of the Harvard Medical School sort of residency training program here. But all the opinions that I'm going to put out here are mine and mine alone. And I think there's a lot to talk about with cannabis, and I think there's sort of ways that people are talking about it in terms of how it's like a completely harmless substance, and I think that's not sort of a helpful way of thinking about it. But at the same time, I might challenge something you said a little bit earlier too, that it's a completely bad thing as well. And I think that sort of the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and
sure.
I hope we can sort of be able to converse around that today, and sort of also acknowledging, both of us are psychiatrists, so there's always sort of biases that we have, going into these things. We have biases towards mental health and health in general. Some people might have biases towards autonomy or freedom of choice and things like that, or biases based on personal experience. We have biases based on looking to evidence and literature, which I believe is the right thing to do when you're talking about drugs. Maybe not so much spiritual experiences or things like that don't have sort of the harmful effects that drugs could have, but certainly when thinking about medications and drugs, I think it's helpful to do that. And bias is based on obviously personal and spiritual experience, and I think it's just helpful to put out there sort of what our biases are, because without acknowledging that, arriving at the truth might be a little bit challenging. And I think acknowledging
Yeah.
all of our biases in it. So.
Well said. I mean, I think when I have conversations with people about marijuana, oftentimes it's interesting. You use the word bias, whereas I wonder if like value. I mean, I think there are biases, but also like there are differing values. So like as mental health professionals, we're probably going to have a value that health is not, I wouldn't say, actually, I don't think I value necessarily health over autonomy, because ultimately when I work with many patients, it's their choice what they put into their bodies.
Fair enough.
But at the same time, I think, like you said, I've sort of noticed that sometimes people are kind of coming with a certain personal experience. I wouldn't quite say agenda, but sometimes when I work with people who use substances, the conversation almost turns into looking for any kind of justification to be able to continue to use the substance. That's been my experience sometimes with people. So I really appreciate you kind of pointing out biases and how people are coming at it from different angles. And so if we're trying to figure out what's right or not right, that we have to really consider the personal perspectives of the people involved, and that the right answer for one person may not be the right answer for someone else.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I think we all sort of value autonomy, we value health, and I think some people might value certain things over others, and I think that's just what.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, Michael, let me just start by. So, can you just tell us a little bit about marijuana?
Sure. Just in terms of
do you want to dive to like
experience?
specific questions, or you want to talk generally first? What do you think would be better?
Well, I think one thing that would be helpful to sort of lay out there off the bat is just sort of definitions and word choice using.
Sure.
And I think it's helpful to think about, marijuana is such a broad term, and even like the term medical marijuana can sort of be unhelpful, because like, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about like recreational marijuana that's used for medical purposes? Are we talking about prescribed cannabinoids that are used for medical purposes? Are we talking about like medical marijuana cards that we're getting and using for medical purposes? So I think it's sort of helpful to sort of break down what are the different types of substances that marijuana contains, what are the different forms of it, and sort of how we take
that would be awesome. Can you tell us?
I think that, yeah. So
when someone says marijuana, what are the different things that could refer to?
Sure. I mean, I think one thing to think about is like, first off, that there's sort of this whole plant version of cannabis, and that's sort of the traditional sort of way that one might sort of inhale or smoke it. And there's different versions of it. Certainly, sort of the most commonly talked about are like sativa or indica versions. There's other types of whole plants that might include terpenes, which are like oils from like animal or plant products that might affect the aroma or the taste of those products as well. And these whole plant cannabis products, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that it contains like hundreds of cannabinoids in them, like hundreds of chemicals that are potentially sort of psychoactive, and sort of we haven't really scratched the surface in terms of what many of them do. But what the most common ones that we have been able to isolate and do a little bit of research on are things like Delta-9 THC, which is sort of what we think about in terms of THC. There's Delta-8, which is sort of less studied and sort of less available in the whole plant as well. There's also CBD, cannabidiol, which is sort of something that's sort of a lot of excitement around, a lot of media attention and things like that around CBD. And then you also have cannabinol as well, which is sort of an emerging area. So I think it's sort of helpful to think about like whole plants, and there's different ways to intake that, whether it be sort of inhaled or whether it be through edible use or sort of other means. And then you have like these other cannabinoids, these sort of compounds that you can sort of distill out of out of the cannabis products that can be created or made into drugs that contain only sort of those types of cannabinoids. For example, dronabinol, also known as Marinol, is a synthetic form of THC. Epidiolex, which is like the only FDA-approved version of CBD that we have currently on the market, the only one that we've studied. That's CBD that's been synthesized. So it's kind of helpful to think about, what are the different products. CBD can be used in edibles and other oils and tinctures, and happy to get into the weeds of that if we need to, but I think it's helpful to sort of
Michael, let me just ask you this.
Yeah.
So in terms of one of the things that I remember learning when I was in residency is that a lot of the original research on marijuana was done like 30 or 40 years ago. And that there's been like, basically as marijuana became more of a controlled substance, at least in the United States, that the amount of research on it, like maybe in the 90s and early 2000s, basically like kind of decreased significantly. And so one of the takeaways I remember having through some of my lectures when I was learning about this stuff is that the studies that we have on marijuana are maybe less applicable now because over the last 30 years, we've bred more potent strains, concentrated the amount of THC so that even like, so in a sense, the effects of marijuana that we sort of have well characterized from the 60s and 70s may not be quite as applicable today. Like, can you comment on that, or is that kind of your experience? Because I don't keep up too heavily. I'm sure not as much as you do in terms of marijuana research.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. I think that's exactly right. I mean, when people talk about marijuana that's been used for like thousands of years, we think about like China using it in 2000 BC for things like rheumatoid pain, or other sources of pain, or even sort of mental health reasons. The type of cannabis that was naturally growing in China or like southern Russia, like had very little content of like THC, and we're talking about like less than 2 or 3%. Fast forward, to the 60s or 70s, people are using cannabis pretty widely, sort of around the streets. We might have, hear people say like back in the day, people are using it all the time. It's not super harmful, and using it recreationally, and even around that time, like the THC average content you would find on the streets is somewhere around 3 to 5%. Fast forward to today, and I think a lot of this has to do with sort of the big industry of cannabis and sort of how we see trends in other areas of substance as well, in the sense that, trending towards higher potency and higher use, and sort of desire to create those products. A lot of, if you're looking for, like, for example, whole plant cannabis, like the stuff that people are using in the streets back in the 70s, the average nowadays is like 20, 30%, and in certain vapes can even go up, and other products can go up to 60, 90%. So the products that we're talking about today that people are using and wondering if it could be helpful for mental health purposes are totally different from the things that, we were talking about back in those days, and doing research off of, and things
just
like
to make sure I understood that correctly. Like, so when we're talking about like 60s and 70s, or even like ancient cannabis use, we're talking THC in you said 2 to 3% range.
2 to 3%. A lot of it's sort of like hashish, or like sort of derived from the natural plant itself, and a lot of that, has a lot of CBD and a higher CBD to THC ratio potentially as well. But strains of a higher THC content have been bred and used a lot more commonly in the last.
And so you said that the THC concentration now is like 20 to 30%. So we're talking about like a 10-fold increase in potency.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then even in vapes and stuff, you can get a 20-fold or 30-fold increase in potency.
Yeah.
And so
when you get a hit or a dab of that, exactly, you're getting what you're taking in that moment is much higher than people were ever sort of using in terms of concentration.
And you said that has to do with the industry. Can you talk a little bit about that? What do you mean by the industry?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sort of opinions on this, and why this may be the case. But I mean, one thing to think about is, as weed was sort of decriminalized and legalized in many of the states, and I think people were really like hoping that sort of these dispensaries could be opened by like grassroots, and that sort of treatment and healing can be taken by the people, and there's sort of this anti-government, even this whole rhetoric around that. And I think it's kind of unfortunate that with the legalization of medical marijuana on a state by state basis, that a lot of the sort of dispensary licenses that are being handed out are being given to large industry cannabis dealers, which many of which have been bought out by tobacco, by tobacco. And big tobacco, as sort of many of us know, are incredibly good at marketing. They're incredibly good at social marketing. They're incredibly good at like, you know, coming up with ways of sort of mitigating sort of the ideas of how something could be harmful, and trying to play up some of the ideas of how something could be helpful. And so I think that's a part of it. And another part of it is, you know, cannabis use also sort of like it follows demand as well. And we see, I mean, we look at the opioid sort of crisis, you know, and thinking about like what's available on the streets. You know, there used to be, you know, a lot of times it used to be like heroin on the streets. And then sort of drug dealers were realizing that, you know, if they can increase the potency of opioids on the street, then more people will buy it, and then more people would get sort of hooked on it. And there's also sort of this tolerance that develops on opioids as well, where like the more you use it, the more sort of desensitized the receptors in your brain are to using opioids, so the more you kind of need in order to get the same effect. So what drug dealers were realizing is that, you know, people need higher doses and potency of opioids. And today, if you look on the streets, there's almost no like heroin, at least here in Massachusetts. It's like mostly fentanyl. And fentanyl is, again, by orders of like 10 degrees or like a much higher order potency than even heroin was. And that's why part of the reason why we're seeing a huge increase in overdoses on opioids as well. And I think, you know, when thinking about substances that where you can develop tolerance, and substances that sort of people are trying to either potentially chase a symptom down or chase like a high, you know, and develop tolerance over time, there's going to be a demand for it. And I think industry kind of knows this, and I suspect that the potency in cannabis will get higher and higher, and that might help explain it. But that's only part of the picture.
Yeah. So Michael, you're kind of, so if I'm hearing you correctly, like one thing is that as we increase potency, and it's interesting, I didn't know that Big Tobacco had purchased a lot. First of all, I didn't know much about the landscape of cannabis dispensaries and stuff, but I mean, if Big Tobacco has essentially like purchased those and are kind of disseminating them, it makes me really wonder about, as you mentioned, they're good at marketing, like, you know, how much of what we hear about the benefits of marijuana and things like that are a result of marketing or other things like that. I'm also curious. So as potency kind of increases, some people will say that marijuana cannot be addictive. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen cannabis addiction in our clinics here. And what we know about sort of addiction to cannabis is that not everyone gets it, but the more you use THC containing products, typically we're talking about like either, you know, the inhalable versions of whole plant cannabis or vapes, and the more that you use it, the more frequently you use it, and the higher content of THC in these products lends to a higher chance that you might develop an addiction to it. And people that do use it frequently, say over 2 or 3 times a week, we see around like 30% of people developing an addiction to it. And I think you sort of talked about a little bit of the mechanism of addiction and cannabis on the stream before.
Yeah, why don't you just tell us a little bit about that? So so a lot of people will say, you know, I use marijuana for medical reasons. Like you know, cause it is decriminalized now. You can get medical marijuana cards, at least in the United States. And so like, what do you, you know, how do you tell if someone is using it? And oftentimes people who use it for medical reasons it won't be prescribed. They'll have never seen a mental health provider. They'll sort of say, oh, I have anxiety, and like marijuana helps with anxiety, and that's why I use it. How do you know if you're kind of like addicted to marijuana or not? I'm not hearing anything. Are y'all hearing anything? Did we get muted somehow?
Hello?
Oh, say something?
Hello, hello?
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, God.
Keep going. So can you tell us how you determine if someone's addicted?
Sure. I mean, some of the signs that someone could be potentially addicted to cannabis are one, having cravings, especially early morning cravings, like waking up to wanting cannabis as soon as you get up. That's a potential sign. Another is using cannabis despite sort of knowing the consequences of it. So examples of that are like, I have patients who have been using cannabis for a long time and it's impairing their work. And as they use cannabis more and more and become more dependent on it, they were taking more and more risks with cannabis, like using it right before meetings at work or during meetings even, or stepping away and knowing that it's impairing their ability to function at their job, but sort of not being able to determine, like, be able to make a sort of decision on that. And that goes back to the neurobiology of addiction that we may get to at some point. But um, also, what else? Yeah,
Well,
using higher and higher doses of it over time. So
but what
developing
about like, I
tolerance.
mean, what about people who say like, let's say I have anxiety at work
Mhm.
and I find that, actually like using marijuana at work like helps me perform better in a meeting.
Right. Okay. So I think it really depends again on this, what we're talking about when we're talking cannabis in this moment. So um, we know that there's some evidence that sort of CBD or higher CBD to THC ratio cannabis products, or even um, sort of the newer kind of cannabis products, are using kind of this entourage effect of various different terpenes and cannabis products to sort of lower the rate of getting high, or the
Hmm.
chance of getting high, while minimizing the psychoactive elements of cannabis, like THC, and sort of the addictive potential that THC has, and utilizing other sort of cannabinoids that could be potentially helpful for social anxiety. There are some early evidence trials that some of these products could potentially be helpful for social anxiety. But again, um, I think one thing to mention here, we'll just take the example of social anxiety, that, in the studies that we have for social anxiety and other anxiety and depression, especially, we'll just focus on CBD for now, CBD edible products for this, but you could probably also apply it for inhalable versions of high CBD to THC ratio products. Is that what we see in these studies is that, and we're trying to still figure out the dose range for these for treating these symptoms, but what we see is that oftentimes, in order to get a therapeutic effect, you need a certain on the magnitude of like hundreds of CBD milligrams to sort of get the desired effect of some of these products. But a lot of sort of what we're seeing, and at least from my experience, even going to dispensaries, is that a lot of these products that are being sold at dispensaries have a range of like 5 to 10 milligrams of CBD,
Hmm.
and you really don't know what you're getting out of these dispensary products either, because it's not regulated. So it's really frustrating. It's frustrating for me as a clinician in terms of helping a patient to navigate through using CBD, knowing that sort of it's an unregulated space. And there was sort of this study done out of Mississippi, I believe, that were looking at different cannabis dispensaries and their CBD products. And they looked at 25 different products of CBD at a dispensary, and only 3 out of the 25, and they were measuring the CBD and sort of the THC content of these different products. And only 3 out of 25 of those products, specifically in that area, had CBD content that was like within 20% of what
Hmm.
they were saying.
Wow.
And there were like some products that were like, that had 0% of like CBD, and it was just pure like berry gummies or something. And I think I think part of what I'm getting at is like, one, the sort of frustration of working in this space. It's kind of like, it kind of reminds me of back in like old school RuneScape or like Diablo days, where you're like trying to make trades and things like that, but everyone out there is out to scam you. So like one in every 10 people who actually wants to make a good trade with you. I've gotten scammed like numerous times in the RuneScape trying to trade items, but like I ended up somehow in the wilderness somewhere and someone kills me. I'm like, how the heck did I fall for this one again? And it's like the Wild West out there. And
Yeah.
like the FDA has shut down, like, anyway, has shut down, or not shut down, but they've warned sort of these dispensaries based off of it. And I'm getting back to my point, and that is that the reason that we're seeing even people who are taking this, I believe we're seeing even people who are taking this completely sub-therapeutic doses, meaning like 5 milligrams or 0 milligrams of CBD, and reporting like, oh, my anxiety is so much better. Like I'm feeling so much better. And I think we really have to acknowledge that there's a huge placebo effect that we see even in our like clinical trials for antidepressants. I mean, we're talking about like even thinking about like the effects of antidepressants on depression, like about half of that effect is sort of due to placebo, meaning like even if you just gave like 100 people with social anxiety or with depression water pills, there was going to be a certain proportion, 20, 30, 40% of those people who would say like, this is great, this is really working for me. And
Yeah. So
we'll start telling people about it. So this,
I can totally see how if people like marijuana, the placebo effect from the therapeutic dose would be very high.
yeah,
Right.
it's twice as high. I think studies showed that like if you
Oh,
believe
really?
something's going to work, like the likelihood of it actually working is twice as high. So you have, not only are you getting a water pill, but you're being told by somebody that it's going to help with anxiety. There's a chance that it'll certainly help, and there's a much higher chance than if you were just giving a water pill on its own.
So,
Yeah.
so Michael, let's just let me ask a question. So, let's say I've got depression or PTSD, and people say like, "Oh, I use marijuana to cope." What do you think about that?
Yeah. I think I'll start with PTSD. I think PTSD is a hot topic for cannabis. I think anywhere between like a third and like a half of people who are getting medical marijuana cards put down PTSD as their reason. So it's definitely something out there. And I really wish I could say, and I'm going to be focusing first on whole plant cannabis for now. Um, but I really wish I could say that like it's effective for PTSD, but honestly, the trials have not really panned out well. Um, Again, the studies are limited. It's very difficult to study cannabis in the U.S. It's still a Schedule 1 drug, meaning it has high abuse potential in the same category as LSD, for example. And so doing any clinical trials with it is very difficult, to say the least. But at the same time, what we've seen is that, in studies, for example, there are two big studies out of the Veterans Affairs hospitals where they tracked people who had PTSD symptoms and started using cannabis. And over time, people who used more cannabis and used it more frequently, this is, again, talking about whole plant smoked cannabis, the higher THC content and the more that they were using it, the worsening of their symptoms over time. And one study even showed out of like, it was like a few hundred patients that they looked at, when they stopped using cannabis, many of them actually had improvement in nightmares and anxiety. And then so you wonder, like, why is it that we hear a lot of people with PTSD find some sort of reprieve from whole plant smoked cannabis and feel like they're, really improving their functional lifestyle. But why is it that this is not panning out in the studies in the same way that even other psychedelics or antidepressants are panning out in the studies? Like, why is there this like discrepancy here? And I think, it's still sort of unclear, but I think if we dive into the neurobiology of it, it starts making sense.
How so?
I'm gonna do that. So, all right. So cannabis. Let's start with like THC. THC operates on a receptor in the body called CB1, and CB1 is located in many different places in the central nervous system. One of those places it's located on is the amygdala. So we know that sort of at low doses of THC, what happens is that there seems to be sort of an anxiolytic effect to cannabis. For example, they've tried to extract just THC into a pill called nabilone in very small doses, like 7.5 milligrams. may be helpful for anxiety and stress symptoms. But what happens is that at higher doses of THC, the effect on the CB1 receptor actually flips. We see that it can create anxiogenic effects on
Interesting.
the amygdala. And the amygdala, again, is our fear center. It's sort of our emotion center, right? And so thinking about like the short-term effects on trauma and PTSD, and I think you might have mentioned this on stream, Alo, maybe once, like in that some patients, especially in the initial dose of a whole plant cannabis, can have a anxiety response or even a traumatic response, and that can linger over time. So there's definitely a risk to that. Then sort of what people were saying before for a while is that like, okay, if you get past that first stage, things start getting better for you. And neurobiologically, what is going on there is that the receptors on
Let's pause for a
okay,
second,
we can
Michael.
pause there.
Let's just
Yeah,
make sure we
sure.
recap. Okay, so our amygdala. So I noticed you're using some terminology. So let's
Yeah,
explain that. So
yeah,
the amygdala is your fear and survival center of the brain. So when we experience negative emotions, oftentimes our amygdala is acting up or is lit up, right? So when it's active,
mhm,
we'll experience things like fear.
mhm,
You mentioned anxiolytic and anxiogenic. So anxiolytic is the term anxio, which is anxiety, and lytic, which means to lyse or break apart. And so anxiolytic agents are things that reduce anxiety or break down anxiety, break apart anxiety. And
yeah,
anxiogenic are things that generate anxiety. So if I
yeah,
heard you correctly, there's a CB1 receptor, which is a particular kind of cannabinoid receptor that's
yeah,
found in the amygdala, which is our fear center of the brain. And at low doses of THC, what that essentially does is acts on that receptor and reduces the amount of anxiety we feel. Is that correct?
yeah,
The
mhm,
problem is that at higher doses, it appears that the effect on the receptor changes, which for people who are out there listening is common. That at low doses, like particular, pharmacological or like herbal compounds will work in a particular way. And then at higher doses, they'll start to work in different ways, or even they'll start to act on other receptors. And so if we take like low dose THC, it may have some kind of anxiety reducing property, but at higher doses of THC, it actually makes people feel more anxious and can almost have like a negative experience or traumatic experience. Is that fair to say?
yeah. That's fair to say. And
And can I
mhm,
just ask one or two questions about that real quick? So you're familiar with K2, I'm sure, because you're doing
yeah.
residency in Boston and I did residency. Can you tell us a little bit about what K2 is, like chemically?
Well, my understanding of K2 is that it's a synthetic form of basically a cannabinoid
So
THC.
so when
Yeah.
I was like working in emergency rooms in Boston several years ago, I remember seeing people who used K2 and they would be like very, very paranoid, very afraid, and like quite psychotic and delusional. Do you
Yeah.
have any idea if K2 acts kind of in the same way that you're talking about, where it like hyperactivates CB1? Like, do we know anything about how K2 works? Because like K2 seems to induce. I've worked with patients who will have K2 and then it's a synthetic cannabinoid and they'll have like PTSD after using it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I've seen this too as well. Yeah, we had a patient who took K2, really high functioning woman, and developed some really bad psychotic trip and had to get electroconvulsive therapy for weeks before they were sort of able to come down to somewhat sort of baseline. And, I'm not entirely sure on the mechanism of K2, but it makes sense to me that it's probably working in a similar way on the CB1 receptor. And I haven't mentioned that the CB1 receptor is on multiple areas of the brain, of like we talked about the amygdala, uh, also in like the frontal cortex, where a lot of our decision making, sort of our ability to like navigate things, our visual spatial, our motivation, drive, all of that, a lot of those things, as well as regulating our emotions. A lot
Hmm.
of those centers are in the frontal cortex. There's a lot of CB1 receptors there. And there's also CB1 receptors in our temporal lobes. And these are the areas where, that are associated with visual effects or even like potential like psychotic effects. And we see sort of that function as well. So, um, Absolutely. I think they're very related.
So you were saying, so at higher doses of THC, we can get kind of anxiogenic, or like it almost creates anxiety or paranoia or things like that. And how does that relate to PTSD again?
Yeah. So what I was getting at is that what happens is that once you get past that hump, and people say like, okay, your first trip might be bad, but if you keep trying it, you won't have bad trips anymore. And
Okay.
like you start developing tolerance, and it gets better, and maybe even starts helping with symptoms. But um, what happens is that I'm going to give an example like ganking in MOBA and like League of Legends or in Dota, right? Like if somebody's calling for a gank once, and you're like, there's a reason for it, you'll go to the lane and you'll help them out with ganking. But if somebody's like asking for a gank every 2 minutes because like, oh my god, like this is a terrible matchup, I need your help so badly, we're never gonna win. Like what happens is you start getting desensitized to listening to this person asking for a gank, and you're like, all right, I cannot keep ganking your lane. We're just gonna lose the game, and I also just like hearing your voice is really troubling. So we see the same thing happen with receptors. Like the more you activate the CV1 receptor, it sort of desensitizes it to the cannabinoid, and it downregulates. I mean, there's less receptors as well. So I know this is getting deep into the science, and I'll get to why I think it's important. And one thing is that over time we see that there's also these CV1 receptors on the part of the brain that regulates emotion. So this is called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And stepping back a bit and thinking about like trauma and like PTSD, a lot of trauma is our inability to overcome some overwhelming situation or emotion, and our inability to process that. And trauma, a lot of sort of
Like when I
what
when
our
I
understanding of
like
how trauma.
when I call for a gank on my lane over and over and over again and no one shows up.
What?
I said, I was just making a joke. I was like, you were saying that trauma is our inability to overcome a profound emotional experience. And I was just saying, like, when I'm calling for ganks over and over and over again and my team is AFK, that's,
That is also trauma.
yeah, okay.
um, so trauma is, and tell me if I need to clarify things, but there's a part, again, it's where our amygdala is overfiring, and we lose a connection with the part of our brain that regulates emotion, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So overfiring the amygdala on its own, and we lose this connection. So in terms of treating PTSD, we want to strengthen these connections between the part of our brain that can process emotions and the feeling of the emotion itself. That's just kind of simply
So
speaking.
how do cannabinoids fit into that? The ability for our frontal lobes to control or process our emotional experience.
So what we see in PTSD is that over the long term, because you have a desensitization of receptors on the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the actual amount of neuronal density in that part of your brain actually decreases. So the part of your brain that is there to regulate and identify negative emotions becomes desensitized and decreases in size.
Interesting. So the
So
ventromedial prefrontal cortex shrinks if you use
yeah,
marijuana regularly?
yeah, no, this is sort of imaging studies have sort of suggested this, and what I'm trying to get at here is that is that what happens when you take sort of high THC products for the long term is that a lot of times people experience sort of this emotional blunting and sort of a difficulty being able to regulate the emotion itself. Their perception of the emotion of trauma and these symptoms can go down, but um, you're not actually addressing the underlying issue, which is through the work of being able to regulate these emotions.
Interesting.
I don't know
So
if I'm making sense
yeah,
here.
let me just see if I kind of got you. So, and I think this kind of makes sense. So if I'm using a substance just at a very high level, if I'm using a substance to numb my emotional state, my brain's ability to control and regulate my emotional state becomes less necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If I'm numbing it, like my ventromedial prefrontal cortex doesn't need to do anything.
Yeah.
And as a result, like, so, I mean, I don't know if we're really talking about atrophy or this is, if we're talking about fMRI studies, I don't think anyone is looking at one patient longitudinally, right? It's like taking 100 people who use marijuana versus 100 people who don't use marijuana and comparing the relative averages of their brain size in this area.
Yeah.
So I think sort of what I would assume is that, if our brain doesn't need to regulate our emotions, the part of our brain that regulates emotions kind of like checks out and possibly is smaller or something like that, right? And so we don't need to regulate our emotions.
Yeah.
The thing that I'm kind of curious about, which you sort of already answered is, in a sense, is that, so I'm kind of curious, Michael, do you think that it's people who have more trouble regulating emotions? Those are the ones who reach towards marijuana? Because they need a substance, or like, since if I have an inability to regulate my internal emotional state, is that the cause of me using marijuana, or is that a consequence of me using marijuana to numb myself and therefore like don't need to develop that part of my brain as much? Like, what do you think?
Probably a little bit of both. And yeah, I think we see that in other realms of research as well. For example, in terms of looking at how isolation during the pandemic affects substance use, we see that people who feel a lot more isolated during the pandemic might have an even higher like reward response to using substances themselves as well, and might sort of go to substances as a way almost to help them self-regulate too. And yeah, there's actually this interesting article on the New York Times that was talking about how like opioids, which is sort of a different beast than cannabis, but talking about how people sort of view their relationship with opioid like that of a good friend, in that like over time you sort of develop an attachment to the substance, and a lot of that has to do with the substance being the sort of the pseudo person that's helping you process or mostly regulate the feelings, and I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of thinking about cannabis as well. And I've talked to people who also have a similar sort of experience that like things aren't really going well in their relationships, IRL, and a lot of times people sort of look to and find these things that can sort of help replace that. But then it's sort of like that friend that sort of seems really attractive at first and tells you really nice things, but then kind of talks behind your back. And before you realize that, you start losing your other friends, and you're also like, what the heck, man? Like, what happened to all these other things? So it's like that kind of friend.
So, I mean, do you think there is because a lot of people are wondering, so like, if I'm hearing you, Michael, like, I'm not surprised at some of these conclusions because I think they're the similar ones to that what I came to, is that, a lot of people will experience some benefit from using marijuana, but really if you look at the studies and stuff, what you find is that if we look at some of these PTSD studies in the veteran population, which you were talking about, that there's a correlation between worsening PTSD and a higher exposure to THC over time. I wonder a little bit about, that's a chicken or egg thing too. Is it that people who have worse PTSD are more likely to reach for marijuana? Or is it that using marijuana sort of numbs yourself and reduces your ability to control your emotions and then can make PTSD worse over time? I think you kind of addressed that because you mentioned that if you stop using marijuana and have PTSD, that you'll see an improvement of symptoms. So there does seem to be more of a causal relationship there, suggesting that marijuana is like really not good for PTSD.
And we're talking about whole plant, higher content of THC products used frequently and chronically for the diagnosis of PTSD.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to make causal relationships with studies where you're not, testing out cannabis, but this is sort of a current understanding of the impact and
And so a lot of people are just wondering, like, is there a healthy way to use marijuana, or is it okay if I just use marijuana to help me sleep at night? Like, that's something that I hear a lot. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly possibly there are healthy ways to use marijuana. I'd say that using products that are, I would caution against sort of, again, high content THC products with whole plant for people who do have PTSD, for people who have psychotic disorders like schizophrenia or have family history of schizophrenia, or other psychotic disorders, or people who have bipolar disorder as well. Also, I think it's important to talk about some of these harmful effects because going to these dispensaries, you might not hear about some of these things from those people. And if I were to go to a doctor and talk about medication, I would want to hear both sides. So before I kind of go into the helpful aspects, I do want to lay out some of these things. And there are associations with whole plant cannabis use for people who have asthma, that it could worsen their symptoms. People who have a cardiac history, it could lead to more arrhythmias and things like that. I would caution against using it if you're under the age of 25 because of its impact on the brain development.
Can you talk a
Especially,
little bit about that?
yeah, sure. Again, this is sort of preliminary data, but the data that we have right now is certainly concerning that, during the development of the brain, which is for men, up until the age of 25, but during the development of the brain, the mechanism is not clearly known, but cannabis use can dysregulate the dopamine pathways that help develop the parts of the brain, especially in the prefrontal cortex, that are required for emotional processing, for motivation, and for motor functions as well. And what we see, for example, there was a couple studies that were done that took a look in New Zealand that gave that tracked kids that were using cannabis over time, from early teenage years to all the way up until their 30s and 40s. What they saw was that in these people, they had, executive function, like what I just talked about, like deficits, but there was also for people who used cannabis from early age into when they were older, there was a slight, but there was a significant drop in IQ from 5 to 8 points. And when they stopped using cannabis later on in life, that didn't recover. So I think this is sort of the body of evidence that we take a look at and we're like, okay, we need to maybe be a little bit more hesitant in terms of, and more mindful in terms of how we're using cannabis, especially, or again, we're back to talking about whole plant cannabis here. But when our kid, and we're talking about potential lasting effects of cannabis for people with a developing brain, again, thinking about like the impact on that. And so there's certainly addiction psychiatrists in my field who are pushing for sort of a higher like age limit for legalization. I'm not going to go into too much of that rhetoric there, but all to say is that there's certainly some concern there, and that's why that's being said.
Yeah. So now people who are listening to this are terrified. I think, people who want to learn about cannabis oftentimes use cannabis, and people are now wondering how big is 5 to 8 points? Like, what are we talking about here? What does that mean for people practically? Like, if you have someone who's so what is, and so this is where, we say we share, let me just jump in with this actually before I give Michael a chance to answer. But so when we say, like, if y'all have questions, you should go see a licensed professional and have an actual conversation. I want to talk about that for a second. So we don't say that just as a medical disclaimer. I think that this is like, if I'm hearing one thing from Michael that's very loud and clear, it's that you can't get a simple answer to these questions. So if you ask a question, which I get a lot, like, is it okay to use marijuana to sleep? Well, I think Michael's already demonstrated that when there's so many things about that question that warrant individual evaluation or personalization, a personal answer. And the first thing that he's kind of emphasized is, okay, what do you mean by marijuana? Are you talking about, like what THC content are you talking about? What THC to CBD ratio are you talking about? Like when you say to sleep, are we talking about, are you using it every day to fall asleep or just certain nights? What are the reasons that you're having difficulty sleeping? Do you have an actual like insomnia? Is it depression? Is it poor sleep hygiene? Like what's going on there? And so the biggest concern that I have oftentimes around marijuana usage, just in terms of like my clinical work, is that a lot of people will say, and I think we kind of see this even from some of the studies that he's citing, that, oh, I have PTSD, like it helps me like with my emotions, it helps me with my anxiety if I'm going to a party or something like that. We'll see people say things like that. Whereas, my perspective as a clinician is like, okay, I'm not disputing that it helps you in some way, but the real question is like, what are we signing you up for long term? Is there some kind of underlying problem here that you're not addressing? Is it essentially a Band-Aid that over time can cause problems? I've seen some really bad cases of things like cyclic vomiting syndrome, which, I think people who use marijuana, thankfully, most people don't get that. But once you get that, it's like very, very difficult to deal with. And there are, really bad outcomes from using Band-Aids, which is basically how I tend to view marijuana, is that, I've seen some clinical benefit. Generally speaking, the best clinical scenarios in which I've seen marijuana used tend to be in cancer patients or in people who have really, really bad opiate addiction that's refractory to treatment. And sometimes you can use marijuana to reduce the opioid dependence and kind of like take the lesser of two evils. I've seen that done a couple of times. And that's just because the risk of being addicted to opiates is just so huge that you kind of like, need to get people off of it. But I think it's like really important. Hopefully y'all are taking this away as well, that like what I'm getting from Michael is that it's like subtle and nuanced and individualized. And so people will ask questions like, is it okay if I do X, Y, Z? And that's where my answer is that like, it kind of depends on what's the circumstances. What's your long-term plan? Is it like, okay, like even if you're using marijuana to sleep right now, is your plan to just continue to use marijuana to sleep for the next 40 years of your life? Like that doesn't sound like a good plan to me. Anyway, I kind of jumped in and interrupted you. But
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And coming back to the idea of sleep, there is certainly some evidence that, again, going back to CBD products and high-end smoked products that are higher in CBD to THC can potentially sort of decrease the amount of time it takes for you to fall asleep and prolong the amount of sleep you have. But what we see in THC products is that it can get in the way of, while it could potentially help somebody fall asleep, it does give people like less quality sleep over time by reducing
what do you mean
REM.
by that?
So REM is like rapid eye movement part of your sleep, and that's important for a range of things, including like processing, contextual processing, and like filtering and processing like emotions that happen during the day, as well as physical benefits as well, ranging from the immune system to cardiovascular, et cetera. And we see this a lot in medications in general for sleep, that yes, they can be used short term. If you're going to use it, like talk to your doctor, obviously, first of all, but thinking about short term, like a few weeks, or not any higher than like 3 to 6 months, you could try to use something like that in conjunction with working with your doctor, but knowing that there are sort of long-term side effects to that, and focusing on other sort of behavioral interventions to sleep, which include like sleep hygiene, for example, reducing the amount of sort of electronic exposure late at night. I think you had like total, I think you've talked about sleep before, but like associating your bed just for sleep and sex and nothing sort of else. Don't do work and things like that with in your bed, sort of this arousal response mechanism, associating your bed with things that help you relax and get to sleep. So I would say, I would try to avoid whole plant smoked cannabis for sleep as of this time. There's not really great evidence for it for most of those products. Again, there's some excitement around sort of this like higher CBD to THC ratio, or these like products that have these terpene and entourage effects that can mitigate potentially THC levels and reduce the amount of time, the high feeling. But I think the jury is still out on those kinds of products. I mean, what I mean by that is like they've tested these on rats so far and mice. And, I think you need more evidence in the human sort of clinical setting before we can make conclusions on that. And we know, anyone who's worked in the biotech space at all knows that things that work in animal models rarely sort of pan out well in human trials. So I think there's a lot of excitement. I think I'm with like some of that for sure. But in terms of a doctor recommending it for sleep, like we're not really at that level yet. And I do want to mention right now, there's only 4 FDA approved indications for cannabis, like at this moment.
And what are those?
Epidiolex for childhood seizures. There's 2 rare types of childhood seizures with French names that I'm not going to try to butcher. I believe there's, appetite stimulation in patients with eating disorders and nausea in patients with chemotherapy. And I mentioned some of the synthetic forms of cannabinoids that have come out to help address these things.
Interesting.
Outside of that, so the FDA has basically taken a look at all the evidence so far, and they basically said there's nothing outside of those 4 that we have enough evidence to suggest that to say to people like it actually works for these things. So that's kind of where we're at with a lot of this.
So Michael, if we say that, okay, marijuana is like not good to use long-term for sleep, like what do you think about people who kind of equate or assume that marijuana is going to be the same as like sleeping medications or sleep meds, like that both of those are going to be bad? They're kind of equally effective or ineffective. You don't want to develop a dependence on a sleep medicine as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, we see, I think you mentioned like sort of the Band-Aid effect. And I think that's how a lot of people who are doing the science of the studies on it are really seeing cannabis. And cannabis is very different from benzodiazepines in terms of the mechanisms of action, but they both also work on similar neurotransmitters as well. And we see this as well with benzodiazepines, but that yes, it can be helpful for sleep, but long term, we really try to minimize use over the long term because of those things. But if you have if you're given like the options of different sleep medications that have been well studied and that have potential use, if you tried all of those and you want to try cannabis because those are not working, I think that's sort of the place where I would recommend people try it out and navigate it with their doctors, just because we just have more studies and other things than we do for things like plant THC for sleep. Now, CBD might be a different story, but kind of similar story in that, again, try other things, but you're not going to die from trying CBD. I mean, you're not going to die from THC, but the harmful effects of CBD don't seem to be as high as that of THC, both like in the short term and jury's still out in terms of long term, but there's nothing that's come out yet that is completely jarring.
So, and the reason to go for sleep medications that are prescribed, if I'm hearing you, is that we basically have more science behind them.
Yeah, I would say that's the case. I mean, you mentioned other things as well, like cannabis for opioid use disorder. Like if somebody came to me with opioid use disorder, I would really do them a disjustice by saying like, hey, let's try cannabis for this, like off the bat, because we have life-saving medications. Like, we have Suboxone, buprenorphine. We have so much evidence for these other life-saving medications. For me not to take a look at these medications that have
I wasn't talking about
evidence,
opioid use disorder, by the way. I was talking about pain management.
Pain management.
Yeah, sorry if I misspoke.
For that. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay.
I may have actually misspoke.
That's fair enough.
But
Yeah. No, that's fair. But it's a similar way. Like I think typically how doctors like us, how we see new medications, especially ones that are unstudied, is that, I think we want to be cautiously optimistic about it because we don't want to do harm to our patients, and we do want to provide the most like evidence-based medications for somebody's symptoms. So.
Michael, what do you think about? So we've got kind of like 2 or 3 different tracks, which I think people are really curious about. One is, the relationship between particular illnesses. So for example, you mentioned that if you have like a family history of schizophrenia, like you should really, really stay away from marijuana. Can you talk a little bit about that? So I think the two kind of divisions that we've got, and maybe what we can do is poll chat if we've got a mod, but we can ask kind of like about questions around, what's the relationship between marijuana use and things like schizophrenia, or marijuana use and bipolar disorder. Or the other route that we can go down is a lot of people have questions about, can I safely use it? What about recreational use? And then other things that people have also talked about, which is like, incorporating, I'll see this basically every now and then, maybe at least once a month on the meditation subreddit, where people are talking about using marijuana versus not using marijuana while meditating. Or we also know that, for example, some of these more psychedelic compounds that have been used in spiritual traditions for a long time are now being studied for certain things like depression and PTSD. Do you have a particular direction that you'd prefer to go, or you think it's important to talk about?
I'm happy to go with whatever the chat wants. So whatever,
Okay.
all those topics are interesting to me. I don't think there's one particular.
Let me see if I can set this. Okay, we've got a poll running. So it looks like people are curious about safe recreational use the most. So what do you think? I mean, if someone asks, can I use weed safely recreationally? What do you think about that?
I think, like you said before, it's a tough question to address, because that really depends on what is sort of what are we talking about in terms of the recreational use of a substance, and what sort of underlying conditions do people have that could corroborate with that. Now, let's say in a perfect world, somebody doesn't have PTSD or bipolar or family history of schizophrenia. Perfect world, they don't have any history of cardiovascular disease. They're above the age of 25. They're not pregnant, and don't have sort of the pulmonary things that we'd be worried about in terms of smoked cannabis use. Can you use it recreationally? I would say one that, like, as much as you can kind of use it to the point where you're not getting high, like that, like I think using CBD, for example, maybe if people equate like drinking red wine or something like that, like could that be something to using it at night to help sort of relax you? Maybe at low doses like that, it's kind of like chamomile tea. If you're going to use cannabis products, if you're going to use smoked cannabis products, and that's kind of what you've decided recreationally, then I would just say try to stick with ones that are lower in THC content, like less than 10 or 20%, and try not to go above that amount, because again, the risks that we see with it are sort of in the higher doses than that. And try to use it as less frequently as possible, and be honest with yourself. Why are you using it? Because if I think a lot of people do say like they're using it recreationally or for pleasure, then if they ask themselves, it's probably some symptom that they're addressing. And unless like those symptoms are sort of like addressed and talked about in other ways like that.
Oh, hold on a second, Michael. Did I hear you correctly? So you think recreational use is... I was kind of confused by some of the dosing you talked about. So I'm not really too familiar with marijuana, like in terms of people don't really use it in my social circles and stuff like that. But I mean, I thought the whole point behind recreational use is that people like to get high, like they like to be, and so, and isn't that sort of what we're talking about here? Is like using it to the point of, high potency kind of THC sort of stuff. Like when people say recreational use to me, I don't think I've never heard of someone who uses recreational marijuana. Maybe this is due to the selection bias. And like I mentioned, it's not like I in my social circles, they're very popular to use. But, I've never heard of the marijuana equivalent of drinking one glass of red wine with dinner. Like it's almost always what I hear about is people, using for the purpose of really getting high. Like they're shooting for that sort of effect recreationally. I don't...
Well,
it's just strange. Maybe it's once again the selection bias of who I've hung out with in the past,
sure.
and
Yeah. So
more, I
I
guess
know
more
that
importantly, who I haven't hung out with, but
yeah, sure. I'd say people have various reasons why they might use cannabis. One could be the sort of the euphoric effect from getting high. Other people might use it sort of a calming or sort of relaxation, kind of like a couch sort of relaxation mode that,
Mhm.
and some people might not be necessarily chasing the high for it. So I would consider that there are other ways of using it recreationally.
Okay.
Um, and there are certainly ways of microdosing cannabis so that it doesn't get you sort of that euphoric effect that comes with the high. Um, and, if you're, in terms of just specifically relating to mental health, it's really unclear, and it's hard for me as a doctor to say like, okay, go go and get high like every day. Like it's probably not going to affect like or every other day. It's just the data there is just really unclear, and so I can't really say like certain what the impact of mental health will be if you're chasing a high and if you're doing that daily. But what I can say is that many people do develop over time different effects from that, and it's hard for me to tell people that like okay, this is safe to do, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I would just say caution if you're going to use it to get high, like would I would caution that with like I think one I guess we talked about one thing that happens sort of when you're getting high. There's sort of this like inhibitory mechanism that happens in your brain. The frontal cortex helps like inhibit your thoughts, right? So like you're chasing the high for creativity or euphoria. It's kind of like playing it's kind of like opening loot boxes, but like ones that are like completely like kind of a little bit more rigged sometimes against you. And what I
How
mean by
so?
that is like it helps. So a lot of people experience the high as like this idea of like openness and having a lot of interesting sort of insights and thoughts about self-reflection and other thoughts that could be like completely divergent, meaning like, for example, like we've heard about like artists and CEOs like using it for creative reasons in terms of getting high because a lot of it has to do with a divergent form of like creativity, meaning like getting all sorts of different ideas out there that are sort of an out of the box style thing. But the tough part about it is that I get that it's fun and it's enjoyable and like to each their own. But the tough part about like being open to all of these ideas is that you talk about on your stream like thought machines, and we've talked about like paranoia and psychosis and all of these things. Like you're like rolling the dice each like you're kind of gambling a little bit
I
because you
see.
don't know like um you're the openness is very inclusive, and what we're not hearing is like the people who do use it to get high that ultimately like may potentially give them certain thought machines or ideas about themselves that they start to believe and then maybe later on develop into other things. And so um, no, it's I think that whether or not getting high will have a significant impact on your health, if you're just doing it like once a month or something like that, and you don't have those other conditions I talked about, is it going to have a significant impact on your mental health per se? Probably not. But if that's something you're chasing very frequently, and that's something that it's like a little bit of a gamble each time you're doing it. And so you hear a lot of positive examples of like people like having creative thoughts on it, but then I think as clinicians we see sometimes these negative examples of people who use it recreationally and have a hard time engaging with us in therapy or being able to think properly
Yeah.
or function at work and things like that. So it's a tough question when in terms of the high aspect. Yeah.
I think a couple of thoughts about that. One is that, so in my experience, like you mentioned, so some people will talk about the benefits of it. And what I tend to find is that there's like, if someone successful talks about marijuana use, people love it so much that it kind of floats to the top of the internet because
Mhm.
everyone who loves marijuana is like, see, this person did it and they're okay. Whereas, what you don't see floating to the top of the internet is, like the vast majority of, I mean, we see this stuff, right, in the emergency room when we're on call overnight about whether they be college students or homeless, part of the homeless population, or just all the people that use marijuana regularly who sort of don't end up in a good place. I think another thing that really concerns me is that what I tend to find, especially like a little bit in our community, is that people will say that they have particular problems, which I totally respect. They'll say, oh, I struggle with social anxiety, or I struggle to find motivation. I can't put together my life. And what I oftentimes will find is if I assess them for marijuana use, there's like a significantly higher percentage than, let's say, the average population. And so one of the things that concerns me about marijuana is that I don't think it's directly responsible, but I think it sort of synergizes with a lot of other problems. So for example, like there's a very high comorbidity between video game addiction and marijuana addiction. And so I even remember looking into the neuroscience of this and was really surprised. So one thing that I sort of noticed is that there was a group of people that I worked with that had a lot of trouble like forming new habits. So that they were kind of in this bad cycle and like they couldn't get out of that bad cycle. And I got kind of curious about that. A lot of them would use marijuana very regularly as well. And so was really surprised to discover that a lot of the habit circuitry in the brain is actually like governed by cannabinoid receptors. So the formation, so when you are doing something for the first time and you get that sort of like reward from it, or like if you do something for the first time and you kind of enjoy it, or like that behavioral reinforcement in the early stages is actually governed by dopamine and the nucleus accumbens. But as we start developing habits, we kind of shift from the nucleus accumbens in our dopamine circuitry to cannabinoid circuitry in different parts of the brain. And I almost got the impression that when you mess with your dopamine circuitry and cannabinoid circuitry, it makes it hard for you to learn from your mistakes and form new habits. Now, there's some neuroscience, like basic science kind of support of that when if you look at broadly speaking, the receptors involved. But I don't think that I haven't really seen many studies that go into that degree of sophistication on habit formation and the brains of people who are using substances. But it really seems to make sense to me because when those people end up getting sober off of marijuana, I tend to find that their motivation and their ability to form healthy habits seems to improve drastically. Now, whether that's a direct effect of like no longer having cannabinoid stimulation in your habit circuitry, or it is a consequence of no longer numbing yourself and like getting in touch with your emotions more, doing more emotional processing so that you can find your motivation and stuff. I don't know. But those are the couple of things that I think about. And then the last thing is that, I get this question a lot where people will ask me, like, can I use marijuana recreationally? And I think you kind of touched on this or mentioned it some, but what is recreationally, right? What are we really talking about? And I've almost, when I ask more details, and this could be a selection bias as well, because, being a psychiatrist, I'm going to get a particular kind of person in my office. But what I tend to find is that when people talk about recreationally, like they're usually referring to multiple times a week. Like they're not talking about once a month. And it's just and I'm curious, maybe we can do a poll on that too. For those of you that are recreational marijuana users, how often are you talking about using it recreationally? Is it more than once a day, multiple times a week, once a week, or like once a month? Okay, so everyone seems to be, we'll see if an actual poll comes up, but I mean, people are talking, I can't tell if they're trolling or not, but I mean, it seems like the majority of them are saying daily, if not multiple times a day. But we'll see if there's a poll comes up. What do you think about that?
So, again, are we talking like whole plants, inhalable cannabis use daily or multiple times a day? Can you be doing that in a way that is healthy? Is that the question?
So it looks like, so here's the poll results. Okay. So how often do you use recreational marijuana? 50% of people say more than once a day. 16% of people say once a day. 16% of people say once a week. 5% of people say once a month. And 16% of people say less than once a month. So I'd say that the numbers are changing a little bit, but 60% of people who talk about recreational marijuana use are referring to it at least once a day. And it looks like about 40% of people are once a week or less, which has been my experience. So I'd say 2/3 of people are like using it once a day or, a few times a week.
Yeah. I think one thing we talked about is like not everyone who does use it every day develops an addiction to that. So in terms of thinking about like, is it going to be problematic from that perspective? Like, people have to just kind of know their own limitations and know what's going on there, and certainly that could be done potentially safely from an addiction perspective. Now, how would that impact your brain in the long term? How will that impact your mental health in the long term? I mean, it's really hard not to think about sort of what we have with our association studies with like daily use. And a lot of the studies have usually used like 2 or 3 times a day, or like 3 times a day or more as like sort of a heavier use of cannabis. It's hard not to think that there's going to be some risk involved with motivation, some risks involved with just like executive function or thinking, and some risks involved with being like emotional processing when you're using it that much. If you know those risks and you feel like risks don't outweigh the benefits, like who am I to say like that this is not something that you should be doing? But I think that there are certainly just risks that you have to be aware of, as you're doing that. And I think another thing that's worth mentioning is that human beings are really bad at assessing our own cognition. Like we have parts of our brain that can assess maybe how sleepy we are. We have parts of our brain that can maybe assess like what our emotions are, when we're in a good place. But when our frontal cortex, which is processing things, is like failing, there's no part of your brain that's saying like, okay, your executive function's at 60% of normal now. We are really bad at it. I mean, like you look no further than like people who are like, challenging like professional Smash players if you're a complete noob and like because you think that you're amazing, and because your friends are amazing, like because you're amazing amongst your friends, like we're just not good at assessing our own abilities and cognition. Or like if we're like playing video games and it's like the 8th or 9th hour and we're like, okay, let's do one more game. I'm fine, dude. Like I'm totally fine. I'm with it. Like we're not great at doing this. And we see this also in driving studies and sleep studies as well, that we're just not great at assessing it. And so what should we look at as a marker for like how we're doing cognitively when we're on these things? My opinion is that, just as with gaming, we have to look at like the people around us and what they think about how our use is affecting our cognition, and come up with objective markers either through writing a diary and like doing, writing out your feelings during the day, writing out like your thoughts and how you're doing functionally, and things like that. And we also see, there was a study, I think in 2017, where they looked at people who were using cannabis for creativity. And what it showed is that the people who used cannabis felt like they had more divergent, meaning like more different ideas in terms of creativity, especially among creative arts. But when they assessed, like during that time, like they actually looked back and assessed like what products of art they made and whether or not they would consider that to be a productive or creative art in retrospect, there was no difference with like placebo. Like essentially what the study suggested was that like when we use cannabis, we feel more creative, we feel this euphoria, it's a good feeling. But whether or not like we're actually producing something creative, whether or not we're actually doing something productive with the time, like, and I've talked to people who are like, yeah, like I felt really good, but then writing a song or like doing something with it, but then when I got out of that trip and I looked back, I was like, okay, wait, this is just kind of garbage. Like, so I think we just had to just, all I can talk about are the risks. Like every person is different. And, if you've weighed all those risks and for yourself, the benefits still outweigh, like who am I to say?
Well, I mean, I think that's I get what you're saying in terms of, the most we can do here is sort of share the risks, but I think that's kind of important to understand, like what you just said. I want to kind of like focus on that for a second. So I think the challenge with a lot of substances is that we just have poor awareness, right, of what the substance, first of all, like if we're really using it recreationally or not. I mean, when I think about, so 43% of chat was saying that they use it more than once a day when they think about recreational use. So that's like a staggering number, right? That's like higher than what I was expecting. But, and so we're sort of poor judges. You mentioned, I think the cognition studies are important because I have found that when I work with people who are using substances and are especially like don't really think that they have a problem, or maybe, you know, they're kind of like in the pre-contemplative stages of change, but they sort of don't really like, they think it's recreational. And they sort of, what I oftentimes find is that there's very poor awareness of like what's actually going on with its use. And if you sit down and really tunnel down into, okay, like what allows you, like what makes it recreational, there's a lot of things that you're using it for. Like even if it's that, okay, yeah, I use it because I want to have fun, but like I can't have fun because I'm so worried about my future. And the only way that I can like enjoy myself on a day is like and have recreation is to get rid of the existential dread of everything that's going wrong in the world and in my life. And then like, you know, I do that through marijuana.
I agree completely. It's a tricky business too, because when you, in people who, you know, once you, I think you talked about sort of pathway of like chronic heavy use in terms of the dependence. You know, initially there's sort of a positive dopamine spike to it. There's sort of a pleasure feeling to it, but over time, you know, these dopamine receptors, like they become downregulated and yada yada. I'm just going to say that end result is that, you know, the dopamine response that we have to things outside of the substance becomes way lower. Our ability to derive pleasure outside of whatever it is, that substance that we might be dependent on, is lower. And, you know, people sort of describe this hypodopaminergic depression that can happen. So what that means is that once you're getting to that stage, so once you get to that stage where sort of you're not deriving pleasure from other things because the dopamine response to things outside the substance is just mitigated because of the neurobiology that goes on, we start feeling depressed. And the only thing that can get us to sort of even a baseline level of feeling is that substance itself. We see this with opioids, we see this with cannabis. So the tricky part is that when you're at that stage, taking cannabis or taking other things, like it feels like it's improving your depression, because without it, you feel really depressed. Nothing gives you pleasure. Cannabis. And the tricky part too that I found in terms of especially like helping people to understand how cannabis might be affecting their mind is that when they stop taking it, there's this withdrawal effect too. If dependence and the use disorder is at play here, there's this withdrawal effect. It makes people feel depressed and anxious. So what happens is it's like people come up to me and telling me like, hey, I've been trying to come off of this, but I'm actually way depressed and way more anxious off of it than I'm onto it. So I'm going to come back onto it. But you know, part of the discussion of like, you know, if somebody does have a dependence or addiction is talking them through that there is a withdrawal phase where you will feel much worse, and that doesn't mean that like the cannabis has been treating you the whole time and has been doing a good job of that. It could very well mean that you're withdrawing from it, and part of our job here together is to kind of slowly come off of it in a way that's safe and that in a way that can help mitigate some of those effects as well.
In your experience, Michael, how long does it take to recover from that hypodopaminergic depression that you're talking about? Like how long does it, because what we're talking about here is neurobiological tolerance, right? So it's almost like caffeine, where like if I never drink caffeine and I drink a cup of coffee, it'll keep me up all night. But if I drink coffee every day and I wake up, I'm barely functional without caffeine. Whereas if I detox off of caffeine, I'll be perfectly functional in the morning. So we're talking, you're referring, this hypodopaminergic depression, you're talking about tolerance, right?
Yeah, and I guess caffeine is kind of a microcosm of it, but yeah.
Yeah. Sure. So you know what? So like, there's some people who were, you know, terrifying with our discussion. People who have been using marijuana since their teenage years and are afraid that they've burned their IQ points and are very hopeless because they use every day. And you know, when they stop using, they experience a lot of these like negative emotions, like anxiety or depression. What are they kind of in for ballpark in terms of like, if I stop, let's say I'm a daily user of marijuana, just kind of gut check, and I recognize this is probably highly individual as well, but what am I in for? Like, how long before I start equilibrating and can sort of get rid of that hypodopaminergic depression?
In terms of hypodopaminergic depression, because we're talking about regulation at the receptor level, this can oftentimes take months, even up to a year. Like it's a tough process, and I think that's why coming off of sort of a high level of heavy cannabis use safely, or not safely, like in a way that's sort of more comfortable, it does take time, and typically like a tapering effect can be helpful, like coming down by like 10 or 20%, like every month or two, something like that, a gradual taper with, there's medications out there as well that can help mitigate these withdrawal symptoms too, and that can help make it a little bit more tolerable. Obviously, doing this with somebody who's experienced, with counseling and therapy is going to be important, things like that. But a lot of these, if there are symptoms of like lack of motivation, executive function, um, emotional processing, a lot of these symptoms, especially like people who started using, in their adult years, can be reversible, like once you come off of it. So there is hope, and my hope is that in terms of the field of medicine, that we can be better at being able to manage these aspects, because frankly speaking, many providers out there, they did like a survey study like a few years ago, within like the last 5 years, and like only half of primary care doctors were comfortable really talking about cannabis with their patients.
Wow.
So in terms of thinking about like how can we be able to engage with people in an informed way, help them to think about the risks and benefits properly with their cannabis use. I mean, obviously, we have a lot of research to do to be able to do that, but a lot of it also has to be like, we need to be more informed and more helpful to people in terms of navigating these spaces than we have been. And I think that's a frustration point as a provider, but totally a frustration point for people as well, who are just wanting to use these substances or wanting to use them for helpful things, but finding that either access to them or getting information for them is really difficult. So,
So let's turn to a couple of these other things that you mentioned. So you mentioned that having a family history of schizophrenia is like basically a contraindication is the medical term we use. So if you've had a history of schizophrenia, either yourself or in your family members, you should steer clear of weed. What's the relationship between illnesses like schizophrenia and marijuana use?
yeah, sure. So I think there's a couple sort of links that we understand here. And again, like the body of evidence is still growing. But one thing that is really kind of signaled out in the studies are that people who have a family history of schizophrenia or have a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, based on a dose-dependent manner, meaning the higher THC content of cannabis you use and the more frequently you use that, and develop are more likely to express their underlying genetic sort of predisposition to and express schizophrenia earlier in their life, and are more likely to express it, like 4 to 6 times higher likelihood than if they didn't use cannabis at all. So that's why we try to caution against using for people who have psychotic disorders. But psychosis is, we talk about long-term psychosis, but then in terms of short-term, we also caution people who have schizophrenia, from using THC-containing whole cannabis products, especially of high THC content, again, because it can increase the likelihood of them expressing psychotic symptoms. I have a patient I've been treating with for like a few years now, and every time this person decompensates, it's because they're using cannabis, and it leads to sort of more sort of hallucinations and voices and things like that. I think one thing we haven't mentioned that's important to mention as well is that cannabis can interact with medications as well. That's sort of an important point to be talking to your doctor about. And I'll give you an example of this, that like when you use a smoked product like cannabis, it can basically operate on an enzyme in your liver that can change the doses of certain medications that you're taking. So, for example, in patients with schizophrenia, coming back to this example, this person was on Zyprexa or olanzapine, which is an antipsychotic, and using cannabis and higher doses of it can actually reduce the amount of the antipsychotic that you're getting in your system. So another reason why, we caution people from using cannabis, especially on certain medications, is that it not only can contribute to these episodes, but it can also limit the amount your medications are actually helping you. So it's kind of a double whammy there, in a difficult way. So that's kind of why we sort of see it that way for schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. Yeah.
And let me just make sure I got this. So it sounds like if you have a family history of schizophrenia and you use, as you mentioned, whole, what did you call it? Whole plant?
Yeah, whole plant forms of
Cannabis that have high THC contents. It increases. So if we just think about this for a second, just because you have a family history of schizophrenia does not mean, like, if your parents or one of them had schizophrenia, let's say, it doesn't mean that you're going to grow up and have schizophrenia. But what we do know is that there's a genetic component that increases your risk of having schizophrenia. Then the problem is that studies show that essentially if you, let's say I have a parent with schizophrenia, so I have a certain risk of getting it myself. And I'm not sure exactly what that is. I imagine it's less than 50%. It's probably like 20%, 30%. I think it's still, significantly less than 50% if memory serves. And then the challenge, though, is imagine you have two kids in that family and they both are, let's say, born with a 20% risk of developing schizophrenia. And one of them uses a heavy amount of marijuana during their developmental years. What you mentioned is a 4 to 6-fold increase in risk, right? So,
and increase in risk of developing it in their lifetime, and increased risk of them expressing it early on in their lifetime is also something that we've seen.
So the other interesting thing there, when Michael's talking about expressing it early on, so there's also data that shows that the earlier you get affected by schizophrenia, generally speaking, the worse that you do. So like people who get schizophrenia at an early age and, for example, don't finish college and aren't able to enter the workforce in like a substantial way, like those people tend to have worse outcomes in life. Like they're not as financially independent. Their symptoms can get worse and things like that too. So part of what we also see with people who use marijuana is that they'll sort of get schizophrenia earlier, which then sort of impacts their life kind of more profoundly. It's almost like, it has like a snowballing effect is kind of the takeaway that I had from the people that I've worked with. And so really using it early is like, can have a profound negative impact on the trajectory of your life, even though it feels like at the age of 14 or 15, if you take a week or a month that you're using versus not using, it may not feel like that big of a deal. But if it increases your risk and you manifest schizophrenia earlier and you're unable to finish school and things like that, that kind of stuff like snowballs. And then like you're 20 years old, like you're not in college, and then you kind of feel behind and you have difficulty like socializing with other people and that stuff. Then you kind of get like more depressed. And I've seen these cases, unfortunately, a fair amount where people just really struggle. And the better cases I've seen definitely happen to people who are, get schizophrenia a little bit later in life and have more stability around them, have more sort of social supports and things like that around them, and they tend to do a lot better.
Certainly the earlier you start using it, sort of the greater, especially starting during childhood.
And what about things like bipolar disorder? Like what's your take on marijuana usage and depression or other kinds of mood disorders?
Yeah, I mean, there's starting with depression, there's not really good evidence that whole plant cannabis use is helpful for depression. I think we talked about this hypodopaminergic depression that we see in people who do use it sort of chronically and long term. Some small evidence, I think we talked about, there's some trials, especially short-term use of CBD for PTSD. The same thing with depression, that CBD operates on like the CB2 receptor, but it also operates on a serotonin receptor called the 5-HT1, which can be implicated in depression, can be implicated in anxiety. cognitive flexibility as well, or sort of our ability to change the way we perceive or think about things. And that's sort of how we think that ketamine might work as well. So working on sort of a receptor that could potentially have therapeutic benefits for.
I'm sorry, can you say that the 5-HT1 receptor you said is affected by CBD?
Yes.
Interesting.
That's my
So
understanding.
does it have, is there some suggestion that there's a therapeutic benefit there, or it like messes with the receptor in a negative way, or do we not know?
No, there's certainly a signal that there could be a therapeutic benefit. I think the most again, these are sort of limited evidence, open label, meaning not controlled trials. People know what they're taking, so there is that placebo risk. But social anxiety, CBD for social anxiety is one area of like a lot of interest, and I think there is evidence that could be used potentially. For PTSD symptoms as well, especially nightmares, flashbacks, things like that. I've had patients who have used CBD, and that's been helpful. And depression, somewhat, insomnia is sort of, there's some evidence for that as well, but it's sort of not as fleshed out as some of ththese anxiety disorders are. But there's definitely some excitement around that, and I think some of that is founded. There's some evidence for in autism and sort of aggression, irritability, maybe ADHD. I mean, we have like a smorgasbord of different things, but I think that especially social anxiety and PTSD, that's sort of where we've seen garnered some interesting like positive evidence for.
So Michael,
yeah.
I notice, I mean, maybe you can explain this. You'll say there's some evidence for, or there's excitement. Can you help us understand like what that means? Does that mean that there's some evidence for CBD's benefit on the 5-HT1 serotonin receptor, therefore I can smoke weed as long as it's got CBD in it? Like, what is it when you say some evidence for or excitement? What do those terms mean? Help us understand.
Okay, so I'm meaning like concentrated forms of CBD in like Epidiolex, for example, which is a CBD version of it is basically CBD that's sort of a prescribed pharmaceutical, and looking at use in conditions like social anxiety and PTSD, we've seen in short term, like we're talking about 8-week trials, like people who take somewhere in the range of like 200 to 400 milligrams ish, and we're still trying to figure out where this dose range is, like we as in like the medical community, that there is some evidence that people who do use CBD over a period of time can develop improvements in these symptoms and not have sort of the psychoact there. So CBD itself doesn't have the kind of psychoactive effect that THC has. Psychoactive as in like sort of the psychotic producing effects or the anxiety producing effects that THC have, and sort of our understanding right now is that it doesn't have sort of the addictive potential, not nearly as much as we see in THC. And CBD can even, there's some evidence that shows that it could even sort of start reversing some of these aspects when combined with THC. So I think that's where, there is some excitement, meaning like excitement as in the media or in sort of even like some very early trials in animal models that like if you combine CBD, THC, and other elements as well, you might be able to come up with a personalized product that may be able to alleviate sort of symptoms you have without giving you that high that could then produce, that may have other problematic effects. And that might, help you with that condition. But it's still very early on in terms of evidence, in the sense that like it's too early for people to like start recommending it.
Yeah.
To
So just to kind of like add some context around that. So, if we think about a clinical trial or we think about how science is conducted, you can have, so Michael mentioned an open label kind of trial. So we think about the gold standard of scientific evidence is the randomized controlled trial, which I personally don't think is the gold standard, but that's a conversation for a different day. But so the whole point is that, you have two groups, they're randomized. So there's no selection bias into who gets put into one group versus another group. We have controls in place. So like we're controlling for things like age and gender and other kinds of things. So there are ways that we can conduct science that give us a strong amount of confidence that we can make a recommendation. And right now, what I'm getting from Michael is that the trials on CBD and stuff haven't reached that level of scientific vigor. So what we sort of have is we'll do a survey of, let's say, 30 people who use CBD, and we'll ask them, how much does it help your anxiety? And those 30 people will say, it seems to help a lot. And so then what we'll do is scientists will say, okay, so there's like some kind of signal here, but we have no idea. We haven't controlled for biases. We haven't controlled for doses. We haven't controlled, like, we don't really know what they're using or how often they're using. So we haven't controlled for all this stuff. So like, even though there's kind of like a bright point on the horizon that, hey, maybe there's something here of value, we haven't conducted enough rigorous scientific trials to sort of really determine, okay, this is a good idea or this is safe. And what I'm getting from, and even if we look at like a lot of the research on psychedelics and stuff, like that's kind of where things are now, although psychedelics in some cases are a little bit further along. But, it's sort of like we'll do an initial study with a small number of people without adequate controls, and we'll sort of figure out, okay, is there something here worth looking into a little bit further? And then we'll do a bigger trial with more people and more controls. And then we'll try to duplicate that trial. And then we'll do a bigger trial. And then we'll really start to do like dose kind of trials where, okay, what about 200 versus 100 or 200 versus 400 or 200 versus 5? And then, so what's the right dose that you need to get this kind of like benefit that we're talking about in terms of 5-HT1 kind of activity that makes like reduces anxiety? And so this is really for us to have scientific confidence that, hey, as a medical doctor, we can, or as the medical profession, we can say that this works or doesn't work. I think this is where like there's a lot of confusion, I think, in the lay public about like, the levels of evidence that we really have to get to, and that you can have a trial that's very promising early on, and even Michael mentioned like animal models. So people will do things with rats, and they'll assess depression in rats, and they'll give them CBD at mega doses. Because the other thing about rat trials, if you ever look at the dosing, is it's absurd. They'll give rats, 100 times the dose per weight that you would give a human. And then they'll sort of see some kind of like promising effect. And anyway, so I just wanted to kind of like make sure that people understood the context around, promising and excitement and it looks like there's some possibility. And for people to really understand that, when Michael says something like that, I as much as people, just got to be a little bit careful about like to what extent people are interpreting that as, oh, this is safe to do, or this is a good idea, because I don't think we're really there yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that completely.
And so we've talked a little bit about mood, psychotic disorders. Anything else that you kind of want to talk about today? We've been at this for about almost 2 hours now.
Trying to think. Yeah, I think one thing to mention just along the lines of just CBD is that, as much as I think people are feeling sort of the frustration that there's like a lot of these ideas and products out there, and as doctors we're not kind of ready to start prescribing using them. At the same time, I'm feeling that as well, in the sense that like even if the evidence were to be there, we're still kind of far from being able to prescribe something like Epidiolex or something like anxiety or social anxiety. Epidiolex is, again, the only thing that we could get on formulary here in the hospital, but even now, like, insurance would not cover Epidiolex, which is CBD again. It wouldn't cover, like, at this time, that for like indications in sort of the mental health realm. So, and the cost is like tens of thousands of dollars. We're talking like very expensive. So I think some of the frustration is that like, even obtaining the CBD for trials, or even trying to use it in clinical practice with patients that maybe, are not responding well to other medications or wanted to use it in addition to those medications, is very difficult right now. I think that's kind of why like we as kind of doctors have to really, at this time, like really help our patients to navigate this field in a way that's
So
helpful
some
and safe.
people are also kind of talking a little bit about, here we are as two doctors talking about this stuff. How do you think? So how? I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this question. So, there's an argument to be made that since we don't use marijuana, we don't really understand the benefits and we don't really understand what we're talking about. How would you? What do you think about that? Right. So here we are, like we're sort of like in our ivory towers in academia, sort of talking about these studies and stuff like that. How do we weigh, what we have to say against someone who's actually like used marijuana and is familiar with it and can speak much more personally to the benefits of creativity and, how it sort of helped them in so many different ways and helped them make friends and stuff like that? Because that is the experience that some people will describe, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as doctors, we sort of tend to talk in terms of like probability and in terms of studies. And we kind of like public health sort of promoting people. And that's sort of a bias because we want to look at populations and we want to have populations grow sort of in a healthy way. That there is bias in that, in acknowledging that there are people who might be using these things safely and not really like impacting sort of their mental health or other things in ways that are coming out in these trials, but sort of are using it in those ways. But we obviously without our personal experience in that sort of way, and in our bias there, like that's something that we don't have sort of insight into. I think we have like a high bar for like sort of evidence and trials and things like that before we use things. We're very sort of adverse, effective sort of people as a field. It takes a while for us to be convinced that something works and that something helps. And I mean, part of that reason is that we would hate for us as doctors to like recommend something and then all of a sudden we find out later how bad it is. And we've seen that being the case for opioids, for example. And I'm not saying cannabis is like opioids, but all I'm saying is that like we have a pretty high bar for being able to say like, okay, this is something that's safe to do and this is something that you should be doing among all these conditions. And I think that there's certainly a bias for that as well. And but I think it's helpful to listen to different sources and conversations about it, and we might be able to speak to the harmful effects a little bit better, and other people might be able to speak to their personal experiences way better than us. And I think it would be completely. This is why I talked about bias in the beginning, because it would be completely sort of untruthful to say that that we are able to provide a full picture of the experience of cannabis and an unbiased source. If anyone tells you they're unbiased, they are lying to you, because there's gonna be bias to every experience. So I hope
Yeah.
this is sort of just a part of people's experience as they engage with
So
this.
I think I liked a couple of the things that you mentioned, Michael. Like, so the first is that as medical professionals, we tend to be more sensitive to the adverse effects than the benefits. Right? So our profession is one where, if something helps people 75% of the time, but hurts people 25% of the time, that is a terrible medical treatment. So if we just look at like the rates of like adverse events, we tend, that's not something that we would, I think, almost ever use, right? The only examples that I can think of, things that have that kind of therapeutic index are like chemotherapy and stuff like that, where it's like dire situations. But generally speaking, I think that's a big piece. I think another big piece is, so we tend to be more risk averse as physicians than I think sometimes people who use marijuana are. Go ahead.
That's the word that I meant to use. Yeah.
Yeah. So we tend to be like very, like medicine has a bias of being like very risk averse, right? If you think about like you go to your doctor and they give you a treatment and it has an 80% chance of working and a 20% chance of causing harm, like no one would ever go to that doctor. As a field, we have a bias towards being risk averse. So we would rather do something that is effective like 95% of the time and even like less effective. I would take half efficacy at a 95% success rate over like, 95% efficacy 50% of the time. And then like of a high chance of like causing damage. Like that's a good inherent bias. I think the other thing to remember is that a lot of people who are, proponents of marijuana use, I don't know exactly what their sample size is. And this is where in medicine, we also have a bias towards public health, right? So I've worked with people that have had very, very positive experiences with marijuana that they say, hasn't negatively affected them at all. And that's great. But what I'm really concerned about, this is also true. I mean, so I've done a lot of this in terms of alternative medicine as well, where there's a ton of alternative medicine, which I've found to be very, very efficacious and shockingly so, which I almost never talk about because it has low reliability. So it may be transformative for one person's life, but like half of the people who try it get no benefit or it even can hurt them. And so I think the other big bias that we have in medicine is that we tend to be like, so we're going to undervalue an individual's experience compared to what the average expected experience is going to be. So we make decisions probabilistically. Like I remember when I was in residency, I learned a very important lesson, which is that someone could ask me a question. If I have major depressive disorder and you start me on this medication, or if there's a patient that has major depressive disorder and you start them on an antidepressant medication, what amount of benefit can you expect? I can answer that question. But if someone walks into my office and says, I have major depressive disorder, if you start me on this medication, what benefit do you think I'll get? And that's like actually a lot harder of a question. Because we can answer questions about populations at whole because that's what clinical trials look at. They look at 10,000 people and what's the average effect size. But what happens in that 10,000 person trial is that, 3,000 of those people get way better, 3,000 of those people get like a little bit better, and 3,000 of those people don't really get better at all. And then we average all those numbers together and we get sort of this effect size, which we then expect. But once you start practicing clinically, what you begin to realize is that even though you can expect an average effect size, there's actually like a high degree of variance between individual people and their experience, their responses to something like marijuana. Yeah. Thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think applying that bias then to sort of whole plant cannabis, if we see something like you said that could have potential adverse effects, our bar for being convinced that the benefits are going to outweigh that risk is going to be much higher. Right? Our bar for whole plant cannabis to like saying that it could be safe and helpful for people with mental health is going to be a lot higher if we see that there are also a lot of people who may be having these adverse effects. And with CBD, our bar for like sort of helping someone navigate through that is going to be slightly lower than with whole plant cannabis because we know that the side effects, most are like gastrointestinal when we get to the hundreds of milligrams or like liver toxicity and things like that. But we kind of know how to manage that a little bit. And there's a little bit, we've seen clinical trials of CBD and Epidiolex for seizure disorders. We kind of know like short term, maybe a little bit like longer term, what it's going to do. And there's some certainty around that. Whole plant, again, has so many chemicals beyond THC and CBD. We just don't know yet, given the uncertainty and given the potential adverse effects. As clinicians, it's like our bar just goes that much higher in terms of like thinking about it and whether or not it's going to be safe or effective. So,
Michael, have you talked about Delta8 THC? Have we talked about that? Because a lot of people are curious about Delta8 THC.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about that, to be very honest. And, we as a field, it's something that's hard to sort of purify out of the plant itself because there's very low amounts of it compared to Delta-9. So that's not something I would be comfortable sort of talking about in the sense that like I don't know of the good evidence for or against it. So I'll sort of leave myself out of that conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair, right? And I think one thing to remember, as Michael mentioned, is that I remember seeing this study. There was a paper, I think, by Rich Saper. I don't know if you ran across him, but I think he's at Brigham or BI, but who was looking at like the amount of like what's in herbal formulation. So if you like go to the store and you like buy a bottle of, turmeric or something like that, what they actually found is very similar to what you were describing, which is I think 9 out of 16 brands that they randomly sampled had little to no of the compound that was advertised if you actually like check it by, I think, gas spectrometry or something like that. I forget, or chromatography. I forget what they used. But, and 7 out of 16 had some of it, but oftentimes like 3 or 4 of those had like lower amounts than what they claimed was in it. So I think the other thing to just be super careful about, and this is why, I think some people are also concerned about us being like anti-marijuana. And I think that's where like, you've got to be careful. I don't know that we're anti-marijuana, but at some point, like you can look at the evidence and you can sort of form a conclusion. And so I think Michael's done a good job of sort of sharing what our biases are, right? So we tend to be risk averse. We tend to be population focused. So any individual person may say, oh, but marijuana works fantastic for me. I think the problem is that when you follow what that person says, what is the likelihood that your experience is going to mirror that individual person's experience? I think that's where, and you can make an argument against this, but I think that like, the experience of it, your experience isn't going to match perfectly the average of 10,000 people's experiences. But I think over time, if you base your decisions on the average, you're more likely to do well over time. Right. So we're going to have that kind of bias, and you just have to be super careful with things like Delta8 THC, because I have no idea who's regulating that. Right. What are you actually getting? And the other problem that we see a lot with this stuff like, fentanyl overdoses and things like that is not only is fentanyl more potent, but like there's no, like, I don't know how to say this, but when you get stuff from a drug dealer, there's no guarantee of quality, right? You just don't have that. So that's where the risk is so much higher. For Delta8 THC, maybe what you're just getting is some inert substance that, because of your placebo effect and because of the echo chamber of your social circle, you think has this awesome effect. But there's just no way of like controlling that information. And so that's why, I think that generally speaking, I'm very hesitant about marijuana use. I'm very hesitant about recommending it. On balance, I'd say like, don't do drugs, kids. And there's a reason why we say that, right? And the good news is that thankfully, I think science is sort of progressing to where we're open-minded about stuff. So we are studying these things like psilocybin. We are studying these things like MDMA and their therapeutic effects. We are studying marijuana and its therapeutic effects some. I mean, it's hard to do that research, I think, as Michael mentioned. But in the meantime, like, it's just, I've just seen so many people get screwed so hard by marijuana that, like, I can't recommend that anyone uses it. Outside of these specific, as Michael's mentioned, FDA approved kind of situations. Because those are the situations in which, on balance, like the risks the benefits far outweigh the risks.
Yeah, with you there. And, there are companies out there that try to like test, like using sort of lab results, like the different contents of like CBD, sort of going off of what you were saying earlier. I'm not going to promote sort of any resources per se, but like Consumer Lab is something that it is unfortunately like a paid subscription, but it's something that I've used to navigate like what how much content of CBD or THC are in certain products, and they try to do a good job, and I can't say like how accurate they are with it, but I all to say is like, as a consumer, like definitely be as informed as you can about these products, and don't take for face value like sort of what you're told about it, even here in this room. And there's always going to be biases. I mean, the opposite end of things as well. Like we see, we recommend, let's say, like people with depression, antidepressants, but there's going to be a small proportion of people, even though we see that antidepressants are effective for many, who just have a negative effect from it or don't have any effect at all. And sort of from their experience, they may feel like, it's something that's not helpful at all, or even have a negative effect, or, develop suicidal thoughts later on, and, can have their own experiences of it that, we don't capture. And we, I think there's certain biases there as well. And it's totally fair to say that, like, their experiences are completely valid. And, and sort of their, people's understanding of the field of psychiatry or even cannabis in general. And everyone sort of is privy sort of to their own perspectives and views, and should go to different sources to get information, ones that are more valid than others. So,
well, thanks a lot, Michael. Do you want to share a little bit about, if you want to, where people can kind of find you in terms of socials and stuff like that, or you want to just steer clear of that?
Sure. I mean, I do have a Twitter. It's something that I, haven't been using that often, but it's something that if people want to engage in more conversation about, I'm totally up for it. It's, I've mostly been using that to share papers and journals and things like that, and to connect with people in the field. But it's at Michael HSUMD on Twitter. So happy to do that. And yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing, your experience and expertise on cannabis. And yeah, we really appreciate it, man. Take care.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Alan.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, what did y'all think about that? Like, I think we talked a little bit about schizophrenia, right? Yeah. So, just to kind of like, so I've been following chat, and some people are saying, wow, chat is so toxic. So let's like go reach to some of our HG roots for a second and talk a little bit about, okay, so if you're watching something like this and you feel combative, or you feel upset, or you feel attacked, right? So what I tend to find is that when people talk about subjects that are charged for some people, the most important thing for you to do is to like understand, why is what they're saying bothering me? Like, I've seen these different kinds of, comments about like, anyway, just people will say, oh, there's successful people who use weed and stuff like that. So like, just think about that for a second. Like, forget about the statement and whether it's true or not. And that's kind of, I think, what Michael and I's point was. We're not saying that there aren't successful people who use weed. That's not what our job is as medical professionals. I mean, even here, I'm not really acting as a medical professional, but when I'm, when I'm sitting with a patient, the reason that I can't recommend it is not like, we don't recommend things based on the fact that there are successful people who have done it. So, for example, I've also met successful people who have been divorced twice and are on their third marriage and are happily married. And at the same time, just because there are people who have been married 3 times and are happy in their third marriage does not mean that I can recommend marrying someone who's been divorced twice in search of a happy marriage. Does that make sense? Like, there are going to be cases of that, right? But there's still, like, you can play the odds. And that's where I think, like, in my opinion, marijuana's kind of problematic there, because if you look at the odds, it tends to not look great. So that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place somewhere. It's just based on the odds, it's not great. The next thing that, and kind of going back to what I was saying, is like, if you feel like arguing with us, or you feel like this is big pharma, or whatever y'all want to do, it's fine. You can have those opinions. But what I would really focus on, if you really want to like understand yourself better, which is ultimately what we're just going to disseminate the information based on our experience and expertise, and you can dispute that if you want to. That's totally fine. Neither of us ever claim, by the way, that we're know everything about marijuana. It's just we're sharing what we've learned. But if you get supercharged or triggered by what we're saying, like, I would start by exploring where that comes from. Right. So if you, because I think like Michael was fantastic. He's like, at the very beginning, he's like, everyone's got biases. We've got biases. And we've done our best to even share what those biases are. But if you kind of default to like, oh, big pharma, like, I mean, I've seen comments that, sleeping medication and marijuana is no different. Like, that I disagree with. Right. Because like, and that's where like, I do think there's a big difference, because one of them has been rigorously studied and the other has not. One of them, when you get a prescription for a sleep medication, the dose that you're getting is basically speaking guaranteed. Whereas when you buy marijuana, I mean, one of the big things that Michael emphasizes is that even the studies that we have on marijuana are from like the days when the THC concentration was 2 to 3%. Now it's like 20 to 30%. So like, how does that affect what we can expect in terms of therapeutic value? We have no idea. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's different about medication versus marijuana. And y'all can say, oh my God, I'm a shill for pharma, which is fine. But I mean, we're not here recommending particular medications on stream, right? Like we may at some point, who knows? But generally speaking, like that's not something that we do. And so this is where, you know, if you're reacting strongly to this, even if you're reacting strongly in like a positive way, like I would explore where that reaction is coming from. So if you watch this stream and then the next thing that you're going to do is go to your friend, brother, sister, significant other, kid, and say, hey, watch the stream. See, I've told you that marijuana is bad. And now these two people on Twitch are saying that marijuana is bad. See, I told you so. Check yourself there, because what are you reacting to? So we're just sharing information. And if you're reacting strongly to this in either direction, like start by understanding what that reaction is. Like, why do I feel so strongly about this subject? And sometimes it's, you know, it comes down to like what we like recreation use. Like we mentioned, there was a question about, oh, like, what do you think about recreational use? And like, you know, Michael was like, oh, I guess if you like use it once a month, like I can see how. And then we asked chat, but like no one who's talking about recreational, very few people, or not very few, we have the statistics, right? So based on a poll of Twitch chat, 43% of people who are talking about recreational use are talking about more than once a day. Another 16 to 70% are talking about once a day. So we're sitting at like 60% of people are talking about daily use when they're talking about recreational, which is very different from the answer that Michael gave in terms of his assumptions about what recreational use was. That was my experience as well, which is like, generally speaking, it's like the number's high, right? And like 16 or 17% was like less than once a month. Now, this wasn't a scientific study. It's not a random sampling. Who knows who's trolling in this kind of thing? But this is my point, is that like this is such a nuanced and individual topic that I think, first of all, y'all should be as informed as you can be. Secondly, be critical of it, right? So everyone keeps on mentioning Snoop Dogg, which is like, sure, like, you know, I would love to talk to Snoop Dogg about his experiences of marijuana, right? Because he may have a different perspective to share. And that's where it's like, you know, that's the whole point, is like what we try to do here is share perspectives. Even when we talk about things like Ayurveda or even like clinical explanations of psychiatry or meditation, what we're doing is sharing perspective. We've never claimed to be the arbiters of truth. What we've done is a fair amount of research. We have a fair amount of experience, and it's our job to try to share that with y'all and for y'all to think critically about what we say and decide what works for you and what doesn't. And especially when it comes to marijuana usage, highly, highly recommend, for all of the reasons that we've said. When we say go see a doctor about this stuff, the reason for that is not like just go see a doctor. It's like to understand that, you know, if you are using it to having difficulty sleeping, there could be all kinds of reasons that you're having difficulty sleeping. Why not address the root of the insomnia? Maybe you've got sleep apnea. Like who knows? If you've got social anxiety, maybe you're hyperthyroid. Did y'all know that feeling anxious, like part of the differential diagnosis for that is getting is a high level of thyroid hormone? This is why we recommend medical treatment and sort of individualized, personalized decisions, especially when it comes to things like marijuana. Because I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all answer, because even if we say on average we wouldn't recommend it, there are people out there who are sort of saying, but there are successful people who are on weed, I use it recreationally, it doesn't really bother me, things like that, so on and so forth, which is fine. We're not disputing that at all. It's just, if you're trying to make a decision, how do you know what the odds are, right? Because you have no idea, like if someone else uses, like, you know, Snoop Dogg uses marijuana, or so I have heard, and they're very successful, very creative, you know, if he says it's a huge part of his success, like, that's fine. Like, the question is, though, if I were to take, you know, 1,000 people who make music and use marijuana, like, where are they in terms of their success? Right? So I've heard. I've never seen them do it. I've never seen a drug test, right? I don't know. And that's the real challenge with this stuff. Because what happens is once your mind likes a substance, then what it does is elicit its own cognitive biases. So I don't like, so this is like, we're going to talk for a second about the addict's mind. So the addict's mind, once it likes something, it will find whatever information it can to like support what it wants to do and will vigorously attack anything that disagrees with it. And if you guys have had someone who's like in denial before, you'll sort of see that, right? And so how do we know whether we can trust our mind? That's what I'm saying, is judge your own reaction to what we're saying. Forget about what I'm saying, what I'm saying is right or wrong. What's your reaction to it? Because that'll give you an insight into your own bias. Right? And like, it's not our place to say you should do something or you shouldn't do something, like in terms of a moral, personal judgment. We can say that, okay, and that's why I think Michael, if you paid attention, he's talking about the risks, right? This is what we know from the research. This is kind of why we say what we do. And if you're like pushing back against what we're saying, it's kind of like, just think a little bit about where is that pushback coming from? And if you start to say that we're, pharma shills, like that's, they surely aren't paying me enough if I'm a pharma shill. But that's just where, being a clinician, I've worked with 1,000 people who have smoked marijuana. I've worked with 1,000 people who have taken antidepressants, and I've seen, like, on average, there's a pretty different effect from both of those. Generally speaking, when I work with people, who come in smoking marijuana, they tend to do better when we stop. And there's even, if you look at like the VA, the Veterans Affairs, the veteran study that Michael talked about, people will use it to manage their anxiety or PTSD or whatever, right? Because it gives you this subjective sense of, okay, this is really helping my anxiety. But then over time, your symptoms are actually getting worse. And that's a really important bias to understand about the mind, which is that we don't know when our cognition is impaired. We don't actually know. We have a subjective sense of what our creative output is, but we don't actually like measure it, right? We don't do that as humans. We just have a sense. My mind is like, oh, this is good. And then if your mind likes something and is addicted to something, it's going to overinflate the value of it in terms of an objective sense. And so it's just tricky. Like, it's sneaky, sneaky mind. So be careful about that. So someone's asking about higher doses and being used as a psychedelic. I don't know. So this is where, like, so someone's saying, I've heard that in higher doses and edibles specifically, that the experience can be psychedelic. Like, so that's where, like, let's just think about that statement for a second, even before we get into what my opinion is. Like, I don't know how to interpret that. So if you ask me, do you think that that's true or not? It's like, what's in the edible? What's the concentration of the edible? What do you mean by psychedelic? Right? So we do know that, in a sense, my answer is probably yes. I don't know exactly what you mean by psychedelic. And how would I compare it? I wouldn't. I don't know that it's really can be comparable. I just don't know enough about it. But these are all good questions. But we do know that, for example, like people who, so I don't know exactly what the term psychedelic means, but let's assume that it means some kind of distortion of reality or perception. And we do know that marijuana can create paranoia and delusions, right? That we're pretty sure about. So I could imagine that it has psychedelic effects. I think I've, talked to people who have mentioned that. But I don't think of it as a psychedelic, generally speaking. I think about things like psilocybin and LSD as psychedelics. Is there a detriment to legalizing it if notably worse things are already legal? So I'm not an expert in legalization or the values of, whether something should be legal or not legal. And this is where, I don't know how to say this, but there's a lot of like, we're already doing this, so why not do this as well? I've also found that if you look at sort of a collective beef, the biggest collective beef that I've ever seen in a population, well, not biggest, second biggest that I can think of, third biggest, fourth biggest, is people who are diehard proponents of weed being really frustrated that weed is illegal and viewed very negatively, whereas alcohol is acceptable. They, and I think they've got a fair argument there. I'm not disagreeing. Like, I think if you look at things like DUIs and like liver cancer and stuff like that, like the mortality related to alcohol seems to be worse than marijuana. And so I'm with you there. Like, you can't, withdrawing from alcohol is a medical emergency and is potentially lethal. That's not true to my knowledge of weed. You still have to be careful. So I'd still work with a clinician either way. But, there's like, I've worked with dozens, if not 100 or 200 patients who have been hospitalized in the intensive care unit for alcohol withdrawal, which absolutely happens. I've never seen a patient who's withdrawing from weed and needs to be intubated and in the ICU. So you can say that, it's unfair that weed is illegal and alcohol is legal, and you can talk about, that's not my area of expertise. It's not, that's not what I don't know. What do you think? And I understand why people are upset by it. There's strong arguments to make that alcohol is a more dangerous substance than marijuana is. Like, I acknowledge that there are arguments. It's just not something I'm an expert in. And I tend to not think about comparisons that way. So I tend to find that that's like very unhelpful. So people say, but weed screws up people's lives and alcohol screws up people's lives. Like, it's not about whether it's legal or not. Maybe there needs to be some sort of public health or legal stance on it. I'm not saying that there isn't, but what we tend to focus on is like the individual, right? And equipping y'all with the information. I think both substances can be harmful. And the fact that one is legal and the other is illegal has nothing to do with whether you have a healthy relationship with it or not. Y'all get that? It's ultimately about whether you have a healthy relationship with it. Okay. So we're going to do a couple of announcements. We were supposed to talk about prisons too. So there was an interesting article about what would happen if therapists ran prisons, but I think we sort of spent the whole time on marijuana. And someone's asking, how do I explicitly book you for coaching off stream? I have a wait list that's hundreds of people long personally. That's why we created the coaching program. So I teach them, a lot of what I know, and we've sort of developed a good methodology for helping people sort of in a similar way to what I do. And it's pretty good. So just so y'all know, the outcomes that I get with my clients tend to be somewhat comparable to what our coaches get. Okay, so we don't take internships. Let's do a couple of announcements. High concentrated THC causes brain deadism, if you say so. Can I pay extra to skip the line? No. Generally speaking, we don't do that. Okay, so let's talk a couple of announcements. So just a reminder that we've got May You Sleep Well event going on this month. So if y'all are interested in resetting your sleep schedule, learning some stuff about sleep hygiene and things like that, that's not that's something that we've got going on. We've got lectures every Tuesday at 9 a.m. Central. Clean Your Room Together is also going on. So this is a community event that has dedicated hours to clean your room starting tomorrow, which apparently is National Clean Your Room Day, which is news to me. Study Together so we've got a Study Together event, which is bot-hosted lobbies to chill out and study together. And in mental health, so May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So we're going to try to learn about stuff related to mental health. And, today we talked about marijuana. We've got some other things coming up. We've got interviews and stuff like that. So any subs that we have during the month are going to go to the Healthy Gamer Foundation. Donations as well go to the Healthy Gamer Foundation. So you can use the exclamation point MHM to get a link on that. Is sleep patterns a good thing? Generally speaking, yes. Do you think that coaching might be more beneficial for some people? Yeah. So here's what I'd say. I don't know. So we have a page that y'all can check out about what's the difference between coaching and therapy. And generally, this is once again a generalization. So if you look at the emphasis on therapy training, the emphasis on therapy training is clinical in nature. So if you have a clinical problem, I think you should go see a therapist, right? And when we think about clinical, what I sort of think about is an impairment of function. So in my mind, what I sort of noticed is that when I work with clients, there's a difference between treating depression or treating major depressive disorder and helping someone find happiness. Those are actually like two very different things. And what's happened in our society is like the two have gotten conflated. And what we sort of like, they're like, I don't want a pill to make me happy. Like no pill is going to make you happy. A pill can counteract a neurochemical imbalance that's causing a depressive episode, which it may be a good idea for you to take. And oftentimes with my patients or clients, I would do that, right? So we would treat depression for the first 6 months to a year, like we treat like major depressive disorder. And then like they'd come into my office like on month 13 and they'd be like, something's still missing. I kind of feel like I'm depressed. We'd use clinical assessments, discover, okay, you're not depressed, actually, you're just unhappy. And there's a whole different plan for that. So when we look at things like coaching, coaching is about moving from 0 to 1. And I think about therapy as moving from -1 to 0. Now, a lot of therapists will take issue with that statement. They'll say, I help people find happiness too. I'm not disputing that therapists do that. I did that as a therapist. But if you look at the emphasis on training and you look at what they kind of specialize in, like, I don't know how many therapists spend 6 months helping people find happiness. Whereas I know a lot of therapists during their training will spend 6 months at a clinic treating people with diagnoses. So it's just a difference in terms of training and emphasis. So related to that, so for example, we have a career coaching program that we just launched. The initial outcomes look really, really good. And so these are like, this is where coaching is designed to help people work through common problems like, should I quit my job? How do I get promoted? People play politics at work and I don't know how to stand up for myself. I don't know how to set boundaries with my boss. There's a lot of stuff at work which you can sort of develop a systematic approach to and like learn how to do better. But I don't think that they teach that stuff. I've never seen a therapy program that teaches, how to manage politics at work. Like I just haven't seen that. But that's what career coaching is for, and that's why we developed coaching. So the emphasis is elsewhere. So if you're someone who is looking to start working, so our career coaching is divided into like 4 categories. So each of our coaches can work in all 4 of these categories, but we even sort of divide it up. So like stage 1 is have no job and need to get a job. Stage 2 is have a dead end job, but no career. Stage 3 is have a career, but I want to do better at it. And stage 4 is I'm actually very successful and accomplished with a career behind me. And I want to like do something that's more fulfilling or give back to the world or like start my own thing or something like that. So it's kind of like late stage. And so there are particular things that we have to sort of address at each of those stages. And so what we try to do is put together some kind of like curriculum or roadmap that our coaches then learn, and then they help clients kind of work through individually. So that's just an example of like, you can get career advice from a therapist, but I just don't know that therapists are formally trained and or, that they're training. So a big part of like our curriculum that we put together was Ethan Evans helped us out. If y'all know Ethan, he streams on Twitch as well. So he was like senior VP at Amazon for over a decade, launched Amazon Prime Video. So like he knows what it's like to let a team of 800 developers in product development. So he knows what bosses are looking for. He knows who gets promoted and who doesn't. And so that kind of expertise we've sort of combined with like my expertise of spiritual training and also like psychiatric training. And we kind of put together all of that expertise in spirituality, psychology, and like corporate work environments. And that's what our career coaching program is based on. So if you're someone who's like trying to get your first job, you feel kind of ashamed of yourself, you're having difficulty putting together your resume, a coach can help you with that. If you're someone who has a job, but you're unhappy in it and like you want to find a different career, but you have so much like inertia, like it's so hard because at 5 p.m. when you're like, you've been working your job and you're kind of burnt out, it's like hard to work on your resume. It's hard to look for other opportunities because like, and what if you don't like it? Like, what if, what's the point of applying if chances are you're not going to get it? All those kinds of thoughts and feelings, like they'll help you with that. If you're at a particular job and you're struggling with a particular issue at work, so we have about 13 common issues that our coaches are well versed in. So these are things like, should I quit? I'll just share with y'all what we can go through all 13. So what we did is kind of put together, so my boss doesn't think I'm doing a good job. I have too much to do. I can't ask my boss what to do all the time. Politics in the workplace. My coworker is driving me crazy. I have trouble standing up for myself and others. This is a good one. I don't know what I want. I'm unhappy with my job. And we're like, okay, what would make it better? I have no idea. I don't know what I want. So common. Or other common one, somewhat related, I'm bored at work. And so the thing is, you look at something like that and you're like, what can possibly be done? You'd be surprised. There is actually like a systematic process to figuring out why you're bored at work and what you can do about it. I'm wasting my time at work. Should I quit? And I don't know how to do what I'm being asked for. So my boss wants me to do something, but I don't know how to do it. And so how do you approach that situation? And that's where like a lot of people may think, well, isn't the solution just learning how to do it? No. So your coach can't, if you're being asked to, manage a database, your coach can't teach you how to manage a database. That's not what coaching is. What a coach is going to explore with you is like, how did you get into the situation of being asked for something that you don't know how to do? What's going on at work? Have you overrepresented yourself? Do you have trouble setting boundaries? Did someone just sort of assume you can do something, but you're terrified of like correcting them because you don't want to feel like you're incompetent, or you feel incompetent? You're afraid that everyone else is going to realize you're incompetent if you tell them, I don't know how to do this. And so what's happening is you've been assigned a task, and every day that goes by, you're panicking further and further and further because there's a deadline. You have no idea how to do it. And so like, how do you deal with that? How do you role play with your coach the conversation that you have with your boss? How do you phrase things in such a way that makes it so that hopefully your boss responds well to you sort of saying, hey, I kind of need help with this, right? There's a lot of stuff you can do in those situations. The problem is that we're not sort of formally taught how to manage these kinds of things. And that's what career coaching is about. So yeah. So that's all stuff that like, you can work through for sure. I've had people who have come, who I've helped with that sort of thing. We're like, so I'll give you all just a quick story time, okay? So I had a client who worked in fintech. So if you guys know what financial technology, so like it's a booming field where there are tons of startups. And so like they sort of came from a more traditional kind of background, and they got hired at a high position at a fintech firm. And what they sort of realized is that they couldn't do what the company was asking them to do. They're like, I just don't have the expertise for this. Like, and so it's kind of terrifying, right? Because there's certain assumptions that you should be able to like do these things or understand these particular things. The particular issue was that this person was hired from a finance background and was hired in a particular position and didn't understand like the technology side well enough. So it's not like they misrepresented their skills. It's just they didn't really understand what the job entailed, because like they knew the finance stuff in and out, but they just didn't sort of like understand the technology side, and they didn't think they needed to understand this technology side. So you show up at work, you're being told like you're given this job description, and then you show up, and then within a month or two, the job that you're actually doing is very different from what the job description you've been given, which is true of a lot of things. Like forget about fintech. It's true of startups in general. It's also true of like other jobs where you can like get a corporate job where they're like, yeah, you're being hired to do A, B, and C. And you show up and they're actually having you do like E, F, and G. And you're kind of confused by that. So how do you kind of talk about that, right? So this is where like the person is terrified because they're really happy with getting hired. It's a relatively senior position. Like they really it's like an exciting field for them. They're like highly motivated in terms of like working there. So they don't want to leave. It's kind of disgraceful. Also looks bad in the resume to get fired 3 months in because what happened there? So they're terrified and they're kind of paralyzed. And so what they said is like, okay, their plan was to, in 2 months, try to learn as much as they can about programming. Forget the fact that they sort of have, financial work that they're supposed to be doing, but that's not really a great plan, right? So we kind of process their emotions first. What does it feel being terrified? Am I in over my head? What's going on here? So like first thing you've got to do is like emotionally decompress, because while you're panicking, you can't think clearly. So like, let's spend some time just working on your emotions, understand where that panic is coming from, understand that there could be some SCOTs at play here, right? So like you've felt like an imposter in the past, and maybe this is some amount of imposter syndrome. And then what we really want to do is help you align with like the company. Like, so why did you work here? What were you excited about? Why did you leave your previous successful and lucrative job to work here? And really like think about that stuff. And then think about, what are you here for? You're here to sort of develop some kind of new technology, which you're super excited about. And so then what you want to do is like have a conversation with people about what your goals are, why you're here, and what's the challenge that we're running into, and how can we work together to fix this? So, and like, it's terrifying, but if you sort of approach the conversation properly, and like we kind of role played out, like what you're going to say, you sit down with the CEO and you say, hey, so I think it's awesome to be able to work here. I think I bring a lot to the table. What I'm noticing that I kind of didn't really appreciate before I showed up was how much technical expertise this role is expected to have. And so what it sort of turned out is the previous person who was doing this was an engineer who had sort of learned finance, but didn't know finance that well, which is why they hired this person in the first place. And so what they sort of said is like, I'm here because you guys want me to develop these kinds of financial instruments, but like, I'm noticing that like the whole reason you hired me is because you want to move this position in a more financial direction, but I'm being pulled in a more tech direction. So every day when I come to work, what I'm noticing is I need to spend my time learning about the technology. Notice they're not saying I'm incompetent and I don't know this stuff. So right now, like I was sitting down and I was looking at how I'm going to spend the next 2 months. And what I was actually thinking about is spending more and more time with developers to understand the technological side. And then what I realized is that the way that I'm allocating my time and what I need to do to succeed in this role is actually like quite different from what you hired me with. So I need to understand from you, what do I need to be doing here? If you say that I need to learn the tech side of things, that's how I'm going to spend time. And I just want you to understand that like, this level of technical expertise is not something that I have. I'm happy to learn it. Or do you want me to actually do the work that you hired me to do? Because that doesn't involve learning that much technology. And then I'm going to need some kind of like liaison between me, like the financial stuff and the technology side stuff. So which one do you want me to do? And when you kind of phrase things to the CEO doesn't realize that there's sort of like all of these automatic things that are going on that like at startups we're being pulled in a lot of different directions. We don't even realize it. That's how things get messed up in the first place. And so it turned out really well. And the CEO is like, oh no, like you shouldn't be spending 2 months learning about programming. That's not what we hired you for. And so I want you to focus on the finance stuff. And that's where then, my client says, okay, then I'm going to need someone to like handle this stuff because I can't do my job based on this kind of stuff. Like I can't figure out how many developer hours to allocate because I don't understand as much about sprinting or like how sprints work or like agile models or things like that. So I understand the basics of those things. I understand that you have a sprint and that you have a certain thing that you're dedicating to, but there's something about this process. The reason that your developer hours are ballooning, there's something going on the technology side, but I'm here to financially model. And like, I need to understand more of what's going on in terms of like what the expectations are. But instead of learning programming, I need someone to interface with. And so that's where like, they ended up finding that. And like this thing that this person was terrified of, actually like at the 6 month mark, the CEO loves the work that they've done. You've raised awareness of a problem within this company and you've offered like positive solutions in terms of how to manage it. And it works out really well. And it's just like, but as long as you're panicked And as long as you're like, oh my God, I have no idea what I'm doing, and these people are asking me to like do something that I don't know how to do, it's like, hold on a second. Because if they're asking you to do something that you didn't get hired to do, like, what's the system at play here? Like, this is probably not how things are supposed to be. And instead of accepting personal fault and saying, oh my God, I need to fix this by learning how to code in 2 months. No, you need to learn how to communicate better. Make it clear to people, hey, do y'all want me to learn how to code? Because this is what I'm seeing. And then collaborative problem solving with other people at the C-suite level of like figuring out how to fix this. And then coming out like way better at the end of it. Versus pretending to know how to do something that you don't know how to do, and then panicking, and then trying to learn it very quickly. And then the big problem there is that everyone else, you're trying to hide the problem from everyone else, right? Because you don't want to look bad. You don't want to get fired. So you're trying to hide it. And the more that you try to hide the problem, like the more that the people don't understand that there's a problem. And then therefore it can't get fixed. And then you're left with the whole burden of like adapting to this crappy situation instead of like fixing the situation as a whole, which is actually going to help the company anyway. So these are the kinds of things that, you know, I don't know specifically that this is what's going to happen if you sign up for career coaching, but these are the kinds of issues that we work through in career coaching. And to understand that there's actually like a way that you can break these problems down. And if y'all looked at our, you know, like my boss doesn't think I'm doing a good job, that's a really good example of recognizing that career coaching from us is going to be a little bit different than just getting advice from someone who has a ton of experience. So our particular take on career coaching is that there's a personal component which could involve like emotions and cognitive biases and like imposter syndrome and all this other crap like burnout. And then dealing with that stuff needs to go hand in hand with what you do at the job. So the two like go hand in hand. That you have to understand your own fears, understand your own biases, kind of manage them so that you can look at the problem objectively and clearly. And then once you look at the problem objectively and clearly, think through possible solutions, then figure out how to implement those solutions. And sometimes it involves super nuts and bolts stuff. Like, what are you actually going to say to your boss when you sit down to meet with them? Let's work through the language. How can you say things in a way, hey, I don't know how to program and you guys are asking me to like, I don't know how to do this. I'm panicking. I need developers to teach me how to program. No, you don't know. Take a step back. Right? Share your challenge with your boss and align things properly. Say, hey, this is what you hired me to do. I'm unable to do this because this programming stuff is getting in the way. So I'm happy to do whichever one you want to. Notice how that like positive that sounds. You're not saying I can't do my job. You guys hired the wrong person. I don't have enough technical expertise. If you have really low self-worth, that's what the stupid thing you're going to say when you go in and talk to the CEO. You hired the wrong person. You're going to negotiate against yourself. You're going to shoot yourself in the foot. No. This is your problem. It's a shared problem. So you share it with them, right? So you say, hey, what do you want me to do? I can do either one. I'm noticing that like the technical expectations are higher than anything that I've ever worked with. Happy to adapt, but it's going to take me some time. So I wanted to let you know because I don't want to, you know, I want you to know that it's going to take me some time to learn this stuff. Or what's even confusing for me is that like, this is what the expectation is, which I'm happy to adjust. I know it's a startup environment. I'm happy to learn new things. It sounds pretty cool. But you've mentioned to me that you need this model ready in 3 months, and this is what I need to get that model done. So you tell me which one you want me to do. So the attitude that you have when you go in there is like, I'm here to take care of business. I've isolated a problem. I'm giving you possible solutions. You tell me which direction to go. And the cool thing is that once they tell you what direction to go, then it's like not your fault if something doesn't work out, right? They said, okay, well, no, like learn the programming. Like, okay, fine. And then when the model isn't ready in 3 months, you're like, hey, remember when we talked on May 9th? And I was telling you, like, there's no way this model is going to be ready if you want me to spend 2 months learning how to program. That's why it's not ready. Right? So you can... Anyway, so that's kind of the kind of stuff we do in career coaching. So it's like understanding the personal side, understanding sort of the career side, and then also like helping people operationalize like how to elicit change. And that could be everything from like how to put together a resume, which there are other problems there. Like if you've never had a job before and you're like, you need a resume to apply. When you put together your resume, you feel ashamed of yourself. There's nothing on the resume. Like this resume is empty. This is pathetic. No one's ever going to hire this noob. And so then you don't even apply for an entry-level position that requires no experience, which is supposed to have an empty resume, right? Or you don't realize that there is some stuff you can put on the resume, that even people who are applying for their first job, oh, you volunteered as a counselor in summer camp like 2 years ago, put that on there. That's a leadership thing. You have this particular GPA, you did this thesis project on human resources and burnout in whatever, like stick that on there. Like you can put academic stuff on there. Like that's all you can do if you don't have work experience. So you stick some stuff on there, adjust the font, and then you submit it. Right? So like there's a lot of stuff that you can operationalize. Okay. We are way over time today, so we're going to unfortunately have to skip meditation. What are we doing? Who do y'all want to raid? I got 2 Fs. Isn't that a deal breaker? I have multiple Fs on my transcript as well. So that's where, you go in, you apply. If you've got a couple Fs, you apply. There may be a part of the application where they say, is there anything else that you'd like to add? And this is where you say, yeah, I got 2 Fs. Here's what was going on. I struggled a lot to organize myself when I was a freshman in college and had a lot of trouble setting my own schedule and structuring my life. But since then, I've learned how to structure my own life, make sure that tasks get done on time, and a couple of other things. So you just address it there, and then you apply. You want to raid train? Sure. Any idea how to join secret societies like the Templars or the Illuminati? No idea. We can raid Anita. Okay. Let's raid Anita. We'll see y'all on Wednesday, okay? I think we've got an interview on Wednesday. So hope y'all enjoyed the weed stream. We may do something about prisons and mental health down the road. But take care, stay safe, and we'll see y'all on Wednesday.